Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my Omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Alison, and I was born and raised in the bluegrass state of Kentucky in the early 70s, where I lived in a very quaint small rustic-style farmhouse on about 60 acres of land with both of my parents and my older brother Peter. We lived in close proximity to a small, very friendly town full of southerly charm and not short of its quirky, unconventional, eccentric characters. For indeed, as far as small towns are concerned, everybody knew each other, and nothing remained secret for very long. One of the most interesting characters in our small town was a very lively, vibrant personality called Miss Violet. She was an elderly woman with bright purple hair and a very fair, peachy smooth complexion, but she didn't look her age at all, for she was as nimble as any 30-year-old, with a slim, lean, subtle body that was as agile as a ballerina. Many believed that she was in her 80s or 90s or even older, for she was the oldest resident in our entire town, but no one ever dared to ask her age, because that would have been exceedingly rude. Many people believed that Miss Violet's vast secret knowledge of herbal tinctures had seemingly turned back her biological clock and upgraded her DNA, for she appeared younger than some of the middle-aged residents of our town. The townsfolk gravitated towards Violet, or Miss Violet, should I say, like moths to a bright light, for she was the reassuring house-like beacon that people would invariably turn to for advice and wisdom. From what my mother once told me, people visited Miss Violet when they were going through a turbulent, tumultuous time in their lives. I even heard a story of a farmer once who visited her when he was having problems with a bad crop that year, and for some reason she knew exactly how to address the problem and sensed there was a mineral deficiency in the soil, and that was soon corrected, and from thenceforth the farmer had an abundant crop and never looked back. Miss Violet always seemed to have the insight to fix problems and treated the whole person, body, mind and spirit, which was why she had a huge success rate with all of her patients. I've never met anyone who knew the medicinal benefits of plants like Miss Violet did. She would always describe the life-giving force of a plant as magical, with miraculous, powerful healing benefits that were nothing short of astonishing. She told me once that she had gained some of the secret, innate knowledge from an old Indian warrior called Black Bear. Miss Violet would make the most amazing concoctions to help people in the forms of teas or tinctures that somehow reminds me of Chinese herbalism today. If I had a cold or something, my mother would invariably take me to see Miss Violet, and she would examine me, feel my pulse, and look directly into my eyes. I would watch in wondrous awe, as powered by her extrasensory perception and guidance, Miss Violet would brew me up an amazing concoction, and within a few hours, I kid you not, I would be as right as rain. The only problem with her concoctions was that they were pretty vile to the taste, but the results were worth their while. I do think the doctor in our town was very put out and threatened by Miss Violet, and who could blame him? I heard he wasn't ever very busy. People preferred to visit Miss Violet, for a consultation with her was so much superior, and furthermore her treatments worked, without the side effects of modern medicine. Miss Violet never charged you a penny for her time, but she would always be given free groceries from the grocer, meat from the butcher's, and bread from the baker's, so she didn't do too badly with her no-charge philosophy, I have to say. Miss Violet claimed that her gift of knowledge came directly from God, and that her heightened intuition enabled her to see things others could not. Sometimes as kids we would visit Miss Violet just for a quick chat, and it would seem that she already knew we were coming. I could never fathom how she always knew we would visit her on that day. She told me once she would see the person in her mind's eye, and later they would arrive at her door. "Come in," she would say. "I knew you were coming. How about a glass of milk and some fresh chocolate chip cookies directly from the oven?" We would sit in her living room, gathered around a cosy, inviting fire on a cold winter's day, and ask her to tell us a story. And she always insisted that the stories she told us were true, and I believe her. One day we asked her if fairies were real, and she told us to sit down because she was going to tell us a true story that happened here in our town when her grandfather was alive, which concerned the Fae, and that must have been a long time ago. When my grandfather was a young boy, there was a man called Cliff Wallace that lived in our town, who told everyone that he had met a fairy at the riverbank, she told us. He told everyone that she was so incredibly beautiful that he offered her his hand in marriage, and she had heartily agreed. She told him to come back in 3 days, and she would pick him up to take him to her people. Well, as you can imagine, when the townsfolk heard Cliff talking so garrulously about this bizarre, incredulous encounter he claimed to have had with the beguiling fairy, they thought that he had been drinking too much moonshine and was talking through his head and making just random stuff up, so they laughed at his expense. My grandfather said that Cliff was stone-cold sober and that he had believed him. So my grandfather sneakily followed him to the riverbank on the 3rd day, and he said that he saw him standing there, and then he watched Cliff vanish in a bright flash of light. He could hardly believe what he'd seen. My grandfather was so incredibly astonished that he went to check the river to see if Cliff had drowned, but he said the river was very still, and there was no sign of him anywhere. My grandfather believed that he had entered some kind of secret portal. For 3 consecutive days, the townsfolk conducted several search parties for Cliff, but he was never found. 3 days later he appeared in the town once again, and everybody demanded to know where he'd been. He informed the townsfolk that he had married the fairy, and that they had raised 3 children together, and that in fairy time he'd been away from the town for over 30 years, as time was very different where he came from. He informed the townsfolk that he would be returning to his family in 3 days' time, and no one would ever see him again after that. Well, indeed, 3 days later, my grandfather and a couple of sneaky townsfolk followed him to the river's bank and witnessed him again disappear in a flash of light. Cliff was never seen in the town again, and all 3 eyewitnesses who saw him vanish in that light believed his story, as far-fetched and fictitious as it sounded. "So do you believe it's true?" I asked. "I believe it's true," said Miss Violet, "for our world is filled with marvellous mysteries that we cannot even begin to fathom. You should pray for the good Lord to reveal a universal mystery to you. And if you have the faith, maybe you'll be surprised to see what might cross your path." As kids, my brother Peter and I would always pray to God that he would reveal a mystery to us, and little did we realise that our prayers would be answered sooner than we imagined. It all began on a very beautiful summer's day. I was about 11 at the time, and my brother Peter was 13. Growing up, we were inseparable and played all kinds of games together. I loved the fact that Peter never looked down upon me because I was a girl, but included me in all his boyish games. We would play with fake guns and water pistols and chase each other around the woodgrove in an ambush kind of scenario, and I loved playing the part of the reckless criminal, and he relished the part of arresting me and playing the good guy, presenting me with a caution and my rights. I always enjoyed these exciting boys' games, as they were infinitely more exciting as far as I was concerned. One of our favourite spots to play was in the Silver Bell Grove, that was a mile down the very uneven, pebbly dirt road on our bicycles. It was a well-maintained wooded area that consisted of very mature trees that were hundreds of years old, which included cedars, oaks and hickory trees. It was called Silver Bell Grove because in the 1800s the town's residents would put a single silver bell on the tree in memory of a departed loved one so that they would never ever be forgotten. And in those days, with all the illnesses like scarlet fever and smallpox, death was not uncommon, even among the very young. So when the tree swayed in the wind, you could hear hundreds of silver bells ringing in remembrance of all those long lost souls, hence the name Silver Bell Grove. All these years later, many claimed to hear the ghostly sounds of the silver bells ringing, but I'm glad to say I never did, for indeed that would have sent chills down my spine and put the fear of God in me. One day when my brother and I were playing cops and robbers in the Silver Bell Grove, I suddenly got the urge to climb one of the large oak trees, as I knew that Peter was less likely to look for me on a higher elevation. Well, so I thought at the time. I could hear my brother announce that he was coming, and he began to make the sounds of police sirens. I could hear him saying, "We've had a dreadful robbery at the bank, and the villainous thug is on the loose. Alert all forces. The perpetrator is armed and dangerous." I quickly scurried up this large oak tree, and as I levered myself up on one of the branches, I discerned a little movement from the hollowed-out cavity of the trunk, which on closer inspection was larger than I'd first assumed. I knew that something was moving inside that tree trunk, but what I couldn't imagine. And my insatiable curiosity overcame me, and I forgot about the game that we were playing. I prized my eyes through the hollow, and that was when I discerned what I can only describe as a tiny human-like face staring back at me. No, surely not, I thought. My imagination is deceiving me. Yet, when I looked ever closer, I could see the head of what seemed like a tiny baby's face. I reached inside the cavity and pulled out the little baby that was swaddled in a squirrel pelt. I was absolutely astonished, and I immediately brought it down the tree. "You're supposed to be hiding," said my brother. "What are you doing out here?" "Not any more," I said. "Look what I found lying in the cavity of the tree trunk. It's a human baby, and it's barely alive, poor thing. Look at it. It's covered in a scant amount of silvery hair, with tiny overlong arms, and a rather funny-shaped head. I think it might be slightly deformed, poor thing." "Why would someone do such a dreadful thing?" said my brother, looking appalled. "I mean, why would someone just abandon their baby like this and stuff it in a tree trunk?" "Maybe the mother was embarrassed," I said, "because the baby was born different. Some people can't cope with their children who don't look normal because they feel ashamed, and this one has hair on its body." "That's no excuse," said Peter, growing increasingly angry. "You don't just dump your baby in a tree trunk and just leave it to die like that. The mother's a monster. The least she could have done was placed it on the church doorstep so that it could have a fighting chance." "We must go and see Miss Violet at once," I said. "She'll know what we need to do." My brother and I hastily made our way to Miss Violet's house, and she opened the door for us at once. "Come in," she said, guiding us through the front door. "I've been expecting you both." This response, of course, was not unusual for us to hear from Miss Violet, as she invariably always had a sixth sense when someone was about to pop around for a chat, so I wasn't surprised by her reaction in seeing us at all. "What are you carrying there in your arms?" she asked me. "Is it an injured animal for me to attend to?" "No, it's a baby," I informed her. "We found it tucked in the trunk of a tree, abandoned by its mother and left to die. It's barely moved. I think the poor thing might be dying." Miss Violet opened the animal pelt to reveal the beautiful little baby that you could tell was very poorly indeed, as its body seemed so floppy, rather like a rag doll, and its eyes were almost opaque and subdued. And the little baby was so unresponsive to our touch. "Poor little mite," said Miss Violet, studying the baby and lifting it into her arms, whereupon she placed it on a soft blanket on the table and began examining its dull, dark brown eyes and feeling for a pulse. "The poor thing barely has a pulse," she informed me. "I'm going to make a tincture for it at once. If we don't help it, I can assure you that it will not survive the next few hours." I began to cry, and the tears were pouring down my cheeks. "It's too late, isn't it?" I said. "We've lost her." Miss Violet looked aggrieved by my pessimistic, fatalistic outburst. "Look at you, with such defeatist talk like this. I certainly wouldn't visit you if you were a doctor, because there would be no hope for me. This is where prayer and faith can make a difference, but bringing the apathetic ingredients of doubt, scepticism and fear into my practice does not wash with me at all. So while you're with me, I don't want any of those negative thoughts around. Do you understand?" I nodded, wiping away my tears, as I watched Miss Violet attend to the baby. She was mixing a few herbal concoctions together, and whatever they were, they smelt as bitter as gall. "How do you know what herbs to use for the baby?" I asked. "I'm guided by my innate knowledge of herbs and my discerning intuition," she said, and then suddenly I seemed to know what to give them. It's like a clairvoyance or a sixth sense, directing me as what I need to do. "What do you think is wrong with the baby?" I asked. "I'm sensing an impaired immune response. When we're born, we're immediately exposed to pathogens and viruses, and our immune system begins to kickstart at once, especially after first drinking our mother's milk. But what I can perceive from this little infant is that this did not happen for her." "Can you fix it?" I asked. "Of course I can fix it," said Miss Violet. I watched her applying the tincture to the back of the baby's tongue, and suddenly the baby got a lot worse and became as blue as a blueberry and began to convulse and wobble violently. It was having a seizure, after which it became almost airily still. I knew almost at once that it was dead. "It's dead, Miss Violet," I cried out in horror. "Your tincture made it worse." "Calm down, Alison," said Miss Violet. "The baby is not dead. Granted, it's barely alive, but I'm making it sicker to make it better. I'm shocking the immune system to get some kind of a response." "Are you sure it will work?" I asked, looking exceedingly worried, because the baby was barely moving. "Give it a chance to work," said Miss Violet. "You must learn to be a little bit more optimistic, Alison." "Well, Miss Violet, it's very hard to be positive when there are people out there abandoning their babies and willfully stuffing them in tree hollows, leaving them there to die because they're ashamed of their differences." "What on earth are you talking about, dear?" said Miss Violet. "This is not an abandoned baby. This baby is very much loved and treasured. Look how carefully she was swaddled in that squirrel pelt. And as for different, what on earth are you talking about? The baby is quite fine." "No, it's not," I said. "The head is funny, it's a dome shape, and the arms are too long and spindly, and the body has fine hair on it." "But this is not a human baby," said Miss Violet. "It's a wild one." "But what's a wild one?" I asked. "You don't know about the wild men of the woods?" asked Miss Violet, looking amazed. "Don't they teach you anything in school these days? When I was growing up, everyone knew about the wild men that lived in the mountains, the craggy outcrops, the caverns, caves and rocky ravines. We would hear curious stories from the indigenous people all the time about their strange, outlandish encounters with the gentle, hairy giants that were known as the guardians of the forest, who would rescue and help animals and people in distress. "No one told us about them, Miss Violet," I said, "not even my own mother and father." "Well, it's possible that your parents may not even know about the wild men. They're very elusive and evasive, secretive people who are spiritually highly evolved, and you'll only see one when they choose to be seen, because they have the proficient prowess or ability to hide in plain sight. It's called cloaking." "You mean you can look at one without actually seeing it?" I asked. "That's exactly what I'm saying, dear." "So are you saying that I couldn't just randomly encounter one of these wild men just by accident?" "You could, I suppose, if the wild man was very relaxed and unguarded at the time and oblivious to your presence. But they are incredibly discerning people with a highly developed sixth sense, so they do tend to know things in advance, and they can read your thoughts." She continued, "Well, my grandfather once told me of a man in town called Mr. Joe Thomas, who wanted to catch one of these wild men for himself and put it in a cage as an exhibit, rather like an oddity that he could show to people who would pay to come and see it. I think he got this entrepreneurial idea from the travelling circus that would frequent our part of the world regularly, and you would pay to see some of the special oddities there. People loved that kind of thing back then, as it was highly entertaining for the townsfolk. They'd talk about it for weeks. I remember going to one of those circuses myself when I was a young girl with my father. Peculiar places they were. I remember there was a horse on show which had 2 heads, and a woman there that was born with a tail like a kangaroo, a man who had a skin just like a snake or a lizard, and another who was born with 3 arms. Then there were people who could contort their bodies into all kinds of strange shapes so that they could fit into a travelling suitcase, others who could hold their breath underwater for a very long period of time, or walk across hot coals in their bare feet. People just loved that kind of thing. What about Mr. Joe Thomas? Did he manage to catch a wildman? I asked. At that, Miss Violet laughed. No, of course not, because the problem for Mr. Joe Thomas was he didn't know how astute the wild men are. They were on to him. They knew his insidious plan, and so they had a great deal of fun toying with him. Apparently they would sneak up behind him and put pebbles in his pockets, and he could feel his pockets getting heavier and heavier, but when he turned around, no one was there. The wild men would leave their very large muddy prints around the streams and lakes to make him think he was hot onto their trail. It would get him very excited, but his searches were invariably always fruitless. So one day Mr. Joe Thomas decided enough was enough, and he no longer went searching for the wildman again. Imagine his immense surprise when he opened his front door to see a wild man sitting there on the front porch eating an apple from his orchard. He said he knew the wild man wanted him to see him. He told my grandfather that the creature spoke to him telepathically and said, "You cannot find us if we don't want to be found, and you cannot see us if we don't want to be seen." And then he was gone, just like that. "Wow, that's extraordinary," I said. "Look," said my brother, who had barely said a word since we had arrived at Miss Violet's. "The baby's moving, and it's wiggling its feet." "Miss Violet," I said, "Peter's right. The baby's moving. And look, the colour is coming back to its cheeks. I think it's getting better." And so it was in the days that followed. The baby became stronger and stronger and stronger, and every day we would take turns into feeding it with bottled milk from a wet nurse in the local town. I loved holding the baby in my arms and seeing it drink the milk, and it would happily drink it hungrily at such great quantities, much more than the average baby of its size. Before long, the baby was sitting up and interacting with us with its bright, intelligent brown eyes. If you walked around the room, the baby would observe every movement, and it began to make this happy, gurgling sound, much like a human baby. I remember walking the baby around the backyard with it wrapped up in my arms and rocking it gently up and down, and I discerned its face would light up when it saw the trees and the blue sky. It really did respond to nature favourably. One day Miss Violet asked us if we wanted to return the baby to its mother. "How can we do that?" I said. "She doesn't even know the baby is better." "Of course she does," says Miss Violet. "I told you these wild people know things. They have a powerful intuition. Do you know it wasn't a random accident that you found the baby in the hollow of that tree? Of course it wasn't an accident. The wild woman chose in advance for you to be the one to find her baby, and she knew you would bring it to me." "Did she know it would recover?" I asked. "Of course not. You cannot know everything. I think she believed and hoped that we might be able to help her baby recover. She's able to read energy fields, so she can discern that her youngling is getting better and stronger. This morning she picked up on my intentions to return her baby to the woods, so she's expecting to receive us. I think you should be the one to return it to her, as she clearly chose you to find her baby." As you can imagine, I was so excited and enthused, and my brother and I, along with Miss Violet, made our way hastily to the woods. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was over the moon. I'd never seen a wild woman before, so I didn't know exactly what to expect, and I couldn't wait to see her. As we entered the woods, everything was so magical. As the towering statuesque trees moved in the wind, swaying their boughs with the grace and the elegance of ballet dancers, and as the gentle breeze blew against my face, I noted prisms of pretty light twinkled through the leaves, dappling the floor in an ethereal luminescence. The verdant green forest with its decorative streamers of resplendent velvety moss swathed the trees like garlands of silvery green Christmas tinsel. We could hear the delightful chirps, twitters and warbles of the bird song, and Miss Violet told us to sit on the soft ground as we waited for the baby's mother to arrive. All of a sudden, the bird song dissipated like the vapour from a kettle, and the breeze stopped blowing as the trees began to compose themselves in almost a gentle kind of curtsy. Everything became airily still. All I could hear was my gentle breathing and the loud sound of my heart thumping through my chest. "She's coming," whispered Miss Violet. All of a sudden we heard the heavy sound of bipedal feet thundering through the woods. I knew that something very big and powerful, with an extraordinary presence, was hurtling towards us with the speed of a steam train on full throttle. And then suddenly, like at the scene of a play when the curtain is drawn back, but in this case it was shrubbery, we saw her. The wild woman was so big that my eyes travelled upwards like they would if I was looking at a large tree. I'd never seen a creature like her before, for she was massive. She was like a giant, standing on 2 long muscular legs, at easily over 8 foot tall. But she was graceful, lofty and majestic at the very same time. I noted that her long sinewy body was slender and very toned, and covered in long silvery hair. But her full breasts announced to the world that she was a breastfeeding mother. I did discern that her head was shaped like a pyramid, and flowed into her gargantuan-sized shoulders in a seamless sweep, and I didn't detect any sense of a neck. I was astonished as her face was so human. Her grey skin was leathery and possessed a wide flat nose, a thin mouth and a sloping forehead. For a moment she stood there, and her deep eyes twinkled warmly as they fixed themselves on the little package in my arms. I immediately got up from my seated position and walked towards the mother, and I handed her the baby. The mother glanced down at the baby and then pulled it out of the blanket, which suddenly fell to the ground in a heavy thud. I watched in awe as she placed the baby upon her shoulders, and it sat curled up on her, snuggling up to the sides of her head, as if they'd never been apart. The mother walked straight up to me. She touched my hair, pulling it away from my face so that she could see my eyes, and she stared at me intently. I could feel her happiness surge through my whole body, and it was almost as if she was downloading in my mind the very joy that she was experiencing, and I felt as if my whole being was enveloped in the arms of God. It was the most blissful feeling I've ever experienced. I felt like a shooting star. The wild woman then turned around and glided into the woods, and she looked as if she was floating on air. She moved with such grace. I was amazed to see that both Miss Violet and my brother were in absolute tears, and then I realised that I was too, as I could taste the salt in my mouth. "Bless us," said Miss Violet, "we're all blubbering babies." But that was such a blissful moment, one of life's precious treasures that can never ever be forgotten, that will leave an indelible imprint on our lives that can never ever be washed away, not even by time. Of course, Miss Violet was absolutely right. How could I ever forget that extraordinary encounter with the wild woman that I now know from research was a Bigfoot? Sadly, Miss Violet did die about 30 years ago, but even in death she looked so young. But she will never ever be forgotten. So if you do happen to come across a single silver bell ringing in a Kentucky woods, it may be the one that I put up for Miss Violet. So there you are. That's my story.
Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, I knew coming back to the familiar seaside town on the Oregon coast, where I'd grown up as a little girl, would not be easy by any manner of means. But I couldn't spend the rest of my days running away from my past. A very sweet elderly lady called Gemma Jones, loved by all the nurses at the hospital where I worked, who was dying, had shown me this. Gemma Jones had been riddled with a great deal of regret, things that she wished she had done but failed to do, that kind of thing, like restoring her long-lost relationship with her estranged sister, as she had fallen out with her decades prior, over something so trivial and insignificant. But now on her deathbed, when Gemma had reached out to her sister in her last-ditched attempts to make peace with her, she had been rebuffed. Gemma had grabbed me with a veiny arthritic hand. She had looked me straight in the eyes, through a penetrating blue gaze, and said to me, "Don't die one day, my love, with any regrets. It's just not worth it. If someone has offended you, make absolutely sure you're not only going to forgive them, but mend the broken bridges before it's too late." I was too proud to reach out to my sister. Now I'm dying with a great deal of regret in my heart. My sister refuses to have anything to do with me, and honestly, I can't blame her. Gemma's poignant words long after her death had resonated with me and drilled through me like a jackhammer drill, and every day they seemed to ring in my ears like an annoying ringtone that would never shut up. I guess I knew I needed to fix up a few gaping holes from my past before I really did end up living or even dying in regret.
I would go to bed every single night, wishing with all my heart and soul that I had done things differently. But at the time I was driven by base instincts, and I guess a large part of me was running away from myself, as facing the demon of my truth was more than I could bear at the time. If the truth be told, more than anything else in the entire world, I wanted to have a relationship with my 7.5-year-old daughter Chloe, whom I don't doubt probably didn't know I existed. I hadn't seen her for over 7 years. Furthermore, my mother Claudia needed me more than at any other time in her life. Her mental decline would eventually become progressively worse and worse. Sadly, she'd been diagnosed with early onset dementia. I needed to be there for her, as she'd always been there for me when I needed her. So I was desirous to return the favour. Ostensibly, never once had my mother ever let me down. I needed to go back home, honour her in the way that she had always honoured me. I had also decided to return home for another very good reason, which concerned my ex-husband Richard. I was struggling to find out how I should approach this matter with as much sensitivity as possible. The matter concerned my daughter Chloe, most obviously, who had been on my mind every day since I'd left my beloved hometown. My brother Andrew had lived at home diligently for over 10 years, with his wife Amelia and their little boy Jack, who'd been born a year later. My brother moved his family into our childhood home, Golden Sands, to be with my mother, as he had noticed that she was not doing great on her own, with her extreme forgetfulness crippling her life. He had worried incessantly that she might leave the gas on one night and bring the entire house down in flames, and so he had felt it imperative to move in with my mother during such a vulnerable time in her life, when it was so obviously clear that she couldn't manage on her own. My brother was now restless for change. He wanted a complete change of scene, even though my mother didn't want him to leave. She had grown desperately fond of Andrew's family living at Golden Sands with her, where she could be close to her beloved grandchild Jack. Yet she was still the first to appreciate and acknowledge that he couldn't remain at her home indefinitely. She understood that. Andrew and his wife and little Jack needed some space to be on their own together as a family. Now my brother was moving to California for a job opportunity that he would be a fool to turn down, as the money and exciting challenges the job offered were very promising indeed, and besides anything else, he deserved a brand new start for his young family. Andrew first became worried about my mother's increasing absent-mindedness and congenital decline. Over 10 years ago, it had worried him significantly, which was why he had promptly moved into Golden Sands. It would seem my mother's current diagnosis of early onset dementia had not come as a surprise to him at all. My mother had been found one night 10 years ago, wandering around on the beach in the late hours of the evening, looking disorientated and very confused, almost as if she was drunk or inebriated. She didn't know who she was, or what she was doing, or how she came to be on the beach, which had been a great source of concern for me and my brother. Golden Sands, like many properties on our side of the street, overlooked spectacular oceanfront views, and were all only a short walk away from the beach. We were both completely baffled as to why my mother had no memory of going out onto the beach in the middle of the night like that. By all accounts, high tide would have been at 1:33 in the morning, and if she'd been out and about then, she could have got herself into all kinds of trouble. The thought had filled my brother with dread. I know my brother would never have forgiven himself if anything bad had happened to my mother, as after my dad died, he considered himself man of the household. It was at about 11:30 at night when my mother was observed running around on the beach in circles, rather like a dog chasing its own tail, and never quite been able to catch it. It was a local man by the name of Pearson Galloway that had thankfully spotted my mother behaving strangely that night on the beach. He had described her as almost being in a trance-like state. At first he thought she might be tipsy or bladdered, after having drunk too much. Then he realised she didn't appear to be all there, almost as if she was caught up in her own illusory world. It shocked him to realize my mother appeared to be stone-cold sober, but behaving in an outlandish way that was nothing short of peculiar. My mother kept dipping her feet into the icy waves when they rolled towards the shoreline. Pearson had called out to her several times, because he knew my mother well. "Claudia! Claudia! Claudia, are you all right?" But his frantic urgency to get her attention was met with a great deal of giggling, as if my mother found everything terribly amusing. My mother looked straight through him like a translucent pane of glass, as if he wasn't even there. He said the experience had given him the chills. She was like one of those robotic toys, running around and around in circles on the beach sand, giggling all the time. She appeared to be disconnected to her reality, he told us. Pearson Galloway had a reputation of being a raging insomniac. He battled to get to sleep every night, so it wasn't desperately uncommon for him to take a stroll down the beach in the middle of the night, if the tide was low. So thankfully he had been the one to rescue my mother, to bring her safely back home. I will never forget that night when my mother arrived back at Golden Sands, looking like a half-drowned kitten. She was shivering from cold because she was soaking wet, and giggling so much, as if she found everything so very funny. We never did find out what she was laughing at. We did succeed in shaking her out of her daze, and when she came around from her delirium, she was shocked to learn that she'd been found wandering around aimlessly on the beach, when she believed she was in bed at home, safely tucked away in her bed, which was definitely not the case. So what did happen to my mother that night? We'll never know the answer to that question. Some suggested that my mother might have been sleepwalking, but the sobering, fortuitous event was a source of great concern for me and Andrew, who were heartily relieved it hadn't happened again. My brother had joked that we might have to put a bell on my mother's toe to wake us up should she pull off that stunt again in the middle of the night. My mother wasn't remotely amused by this suggestion. I gather they used to perform this practice when burying dead people, in case they'd been accidentally buried alive. The bell would get people's attention so that the person could be rescued from their grave. When it came to my mother's condition, the tests from the doctor's office had been rather inconclusive, but I believe even back then these may have been early signs of dementia, although I dare say the experts would disagree with me on this. My mother Claudia had not been diagnosed with dementia until now, 10 long years later after that incident. It was Andrew who had encouraged me to return home, to take care of Mum in his place. As being a nurse by profession, it made a lot of sense to him that I should watch over our mother during this tumultuous time. Furthermore, he didn't know how long we had Mum in a reasonable, coherent condition like this, where she still knew who we were and could interact with us as she had always done. But invariably there would still be blips when she switched off, like a computer that occasionally becomes faulty and needs to be reprogrammed. We knew there would come a time when me and Andrew would become strangers in my mother's life, and that did not bear thinking about. The thought of my mother not knowing who we were freaked me out, as it did Andrew, but we both knew well that this was a progression of the disease and would eventually be expected to happen. I was clued up about dementia after having worked in a hospital, but it's always incredibly different when the condition affects one of your own beloved family members, as then it's far too close to home for comfort. I certainly dreaded the day when my mother would look at me with a blank, vacuous stare that registered no recollection and said to me, "Who are you?" And I knew I had to prepare myself emotionally for such an eventuality, as it wasn't so much a question of if it would happen, but more a question of when. My mother always used to say growing up that one of her biggest fears in life would be losing her mind, and it seemed that her worst fear would be realized. Suffice to say, coming back home, I knew I had to prepare myself for all manner of confrontations that I would likely receive, and believe me, I'm the kind of person that hates confrontation of any kind. But most especially, I needed to be wary of my ex-husband Richard, who would not be remotely pleased to see me after what I did. I knew I would have to brave the storm of condemnation and judgments that would be flung my way indiscriminately, like hailstones blasting out of the sky, creating havoc wherever they fall. What my brother did not know was that I had been looking for the quintessential excuse to come home, as there were things I needed to do to correct some of the wrongs in my life, some of the gaping holes, so to speak, that had been growing ever bigger and bigger with every passing year, and were badly needing a good repair job. Furthermore, my brother Andrew was going to pay me to look after my mother, given he was earning good money, especially if he was to accept this great job opportunity in California. My brother had told me that he would so much rather pay me to nurse our mother than a random nurse who was emotionally disconnected to her. I was, by profession, a real nurse, so instead of working at the hospital, I would become my mother's full-time carer. It was a win-win situation, and I was more than qualified to take care of her. I was looking greatly forward to spending quality time with my mother before her mental health invariably declined. I wanted to enjoy what time my mother had left, while she still remained in her right mind. Regretfully, she did have fleeting episodes when her memory betrayed her, when she couldn't remember whether she'd eaten that day or not. On one occasion she'd popped to the grocery store to buy peanut butter over 5 times in one day, repeating the journey over and over again. So sometimes her memory could be very vague, but as my brother would joke, at least there was no chance of us ever running out of peanut butter any time soon. And with a forgetful person around like my mother, you could easily prepare for Armageddon. "Aoife, I really need you to take care of Mum," Andrew had told me. "It's very important you come back home. Mum needs you. Besides, it will be good for you to spend quality time with her before she begins to steadily decline. I know she could do with your help around the house, with cleaning, cooking and shopping, and she will very much enjoy your company. She doesn't need a strange nurse or housekeeper taking over her life for her. She'd find that far too intrusive." "I'm not sure coming back home is a great idea, Andrew," I'd said, my stomach twisting itself into knots, my heart beginning to flap in my chest cavity like a flustered pigeon that had been startled by the family cat. Of course I wanted to come back very much, and to help my mother. But did I have the courage to do it? I wasn't quite sure I did. I'd thought about returning home often enough, but I was still gripped with a vacillating hesitancy to do so, and a terrible fear of unsavoury confrontations that would make me cower like a frightened cat, hiding under the bed. My brother was silent for a brief moment, and then he said in a somewhat pleading tone of voice, "I need to accept this job, Aoife, as I'm sure you can appreciate. It's very important for me. I need to do this for Amelia and Jack. I won't be able to accept it if you don't come back home. One of us needs to be here for our mother. I've been with her for over 10 years now, Aoife, and I would stay longer, but this job offer is too irresistible to refuse, and I think that Amelia and Jack would very much appreciate a change of scene. I need this, Aoife. I really do." "Of course you need to take the job, Andrew. You can't possibly turn it down. That would be absolutely insane." "The last thing I want to do is to manipulate you, Aoife. But if the truth be told, I can't possibly accept the position in California unless you agree to move in with Mum. I think if I were to bring a stranger into her household, a care nurse perhaps, or someone like that, she would be very resistant to such an idea. You know what Mum's like. She's as stubborn as an old mule, and she doesn't do change awfully well. If you move in with her, things would be different. Mum would welcome you moving back in with her. She's in the early stages of her disease, so being around familiar faces will bring her considerable comfort, reassurance, and the feeling of stability that she craves. Mum has really missed you so much, Aoife. You have absolutely no idea about how much. She's talked about you incessantly. You've been away for far too long, and that's been insanely tough on her, because the two of you are very close.
Besides anything else, Aoife, she's not ready to be taken to some kind of care home, is she? It's far too early for that to be considered. She's still in excellent shape, you know. And apart from anything else, don't you want to see Mum? Be around her while she's still got her marbles about her? Because that won't last for very long, you know. You've missed out so much being away for so long, Aoife. You've got a lot of making up to do.
Of course I want to come back home, Andrew. I've missed Mum so much. I've missed you. I've missed Golden Sands. That's not the problem, and you know it. It's the ghosts of the past that may come back to haunt me that I'm worried about. I don't know if I can deal with them. I'm not sure I'm tough enough, Andrew, for all that. I'm a bit of a wimp. Actually, I'm a very big one.
I appreciate, Aoife, it's not going to be easy coming back home for you. But you can't possibly stay away from home forever. You're not a coward, Aoife. Whatever you may say, you are no coward. I strongly dispute that. If people judge you, that's their problem, not yours. You did what you did at the time because you were in a very bad place. You reacted in a way that was fitting for you at the time. If some people have a problem with that, it's their cross to bear, not yours. If people around here haven't got anything better to do than gossip and snigger about you after you've been gone for 7 years, well, then I feel decidedly sorry for them. It only emphasizes to me what a pathetic, pitiful life they invariably have.
I don't think I can do it, Andrew. I really don't. 7 years is a long, long time. I'm afraid people have got long memories. What will they think of me if I suddenly rock up on the scene after such a long leave of absence? They'll be so quick to judge me, believe the very worst of me, because of what I did.
Aoife, let go of this, will you? For God's sake, girl, let it go. Don't you see you're punishing yourself? If I've learnt anything about this life, it is to stop caring what other people think, and not to give a damn about how they react to you. Yes, they will gossip about you when they learn you're back. Take it from me, they will. They certainly gossiped enough about you when you left town, and they said some pretty hurtful, spiteful things to me about you. They weren't true, of course. You know what, Aoife? We ignored the trolls, and you must do the same. Stand up for yourself, for God's sake. Quit being a shrinking violet, why don't you?
I know you're right, Andrew. Everything you say makes perfect sense. But it's harder to put into practice, it really is.
Listen, Aoife, I'm in no doubt when some of the locals see you again, they'll give you a piece of their mind and tell you what a dreadful person they think you are. But I know the truth, and so do you. Don't let those trolls get you down. They will never understand what you went through back then. They don't have a clue.
It's true. They don't know the half of it.
Think about it, sis. If you look on social media, you'll see all manners of divided opinions that people have about various things that happen around the world. People can be divided. They can be ruthlessly judgmental. Some people will be kind, others downright cruel. It's the nature of the beast. Do you know what I've discovered, sis? Is that you cannot please all the people all of the time, no matter what you do in life. Let's not kid, Aoife. There are always going to be people who have ruffled feathers. Such people will always find fault, no matter what you do. They get a buzz out of being unkind, due to the fact that they're so damn miserable with their lot, that if they pull somebody else's life apart, it makes them feel a whole lot better about themselves.
You're right about that, Richard, I agreed.
You know what, Aoife? I remember reading somewhere that sometimes even the most first-class gourmet restaurants with squeaky clean reputations and Michelin stars to their names will get that one person that dines out at their restaurant that will find fault with their meal, even though it's as close to perfect as you can get. Such people cause a scene, make everything desperately unpleasant for everybody else. You're always going to find one wasp among the honeybees who doesn't belong and wants to cause chaos and discord. It's a way of life, sis. You need to take it in your stride. Everything is going to be all right in the end. I can promise you that. Besides, I'm sure you want to go and see Richard and talk to him. He's not so unreasonable, Aoife, as you might believe. I know you're longing to see little Chloe again, and that is never going to happen unless you take the bull by the horns.
I don't know, Andrew. I don't think that Richard has ever forgiven me for what I did. And I'm not sure he's going to be happy about me getting to see Chloe.
Well, he's going to have to get over it, isn't he? Said my brother sharply. He's not stupid. He must know you had your reasons for leaving town. He may not understand why you did it, but you need to get through to him that things weren't easy for you back then. You have your rights as a mother, Aoife, and he needs to appreciate that.
I know, but you yourself told me that Richard is living with another woman now. I'm not sure how she's going to react to my being in town again. She might see me as a threat.
Well, she's going to have to get used to it, isn't she? She knows that you have a daughter with Richard, and she's going to have to accept that whether she likes it or not.
Well, I suppose you're right, Andrew.
Of course I'm right, Aoife. When have I ever been wrong about anything? My brother teased.
I chuckled. One thing that hasn't changed, Andrew, is you're still pretty sure of yourself, aren't you? As cocky as ever, if you don't mind my saying so.
Of course I'm right, sis. That's why I'm sure as eggs that moving in with Mum on your part is a grand idea. You need to come home as soon as you possibly can, Aoife. Mum needs you, I need you, we all need you. And you need to heal some of those old festering wounds from the past. Running away from them is not going to fix them, is it? It's rather like abandoning an abscess in the gums that gets progressively worse, that only a trip to the dentist will ultimately fix. Coming back home is the root canal treatment you need to bring healing into your life, Aoife.
Well, when you put it like that so eloquently, Andrew, how can I refuse you? All right, I'll do it. I'll come back home. My brother seemed to be saying hallelujah down the phone, and I knew I couldn't backtrack now. I had promised I would return home, and I was not going to dishonour my word. My mother needed me, and I would be there for her, no matter what, even if it meant I had to put up with a lot of condemnation from some of my friends in town, whom I hadn't seen in over 7 years, whom I didn't doubt had a very bleak opinion of me by now. As far as I was concerned, it was a win-win situation to move in with Mother again. It would be strange waking up in my own childhood bedroom after all these years, which my brother assured me had been kept the way I'd left it, when me and my husband Richard had been living with my mother, while we waited for our home to be built. At the time there had been all kinds of roadblocks that we had had to overcome. Richard was now living in the house we'd designed together, with his fiancée and our little girl Chloe. I had walked out on our marriage all those years ago, when our designer home had been completed. We had lived there for all but a week before Chloe had been born. So when we returned home, everything in our life had been perfect, until it was not. One day when Chloe was 6 months old, my mother had been taking care of her at Golden Sands to give me a break from my childcare responsibilities, as being a full-time mother was absolutely exhausting. But something dramatic had happened that day that had shredded my life apart into hundreds of pieces. I had left a note for Richard on our refrigerator to say that I couldn't go on this way, for when the brutal truth was fully realized, I knew I would not be able to look Chloe in the face again. I'm quite sure Richard didn't have a clue what the note meant, or what on earth I was talking about, but some secrets are best not shared, because they can leave a trail of devastation in their wake, like the chaos after a tsunami, and I couldn't do that to Richard. I knew I needed to get as far away from my hometown as possible, without looking back. I moved to Florida. I'd been resolutely independent, living there in Pensacola, which is the westernmost city in the Florida Panhandle, in the county seat of Escambia, where I'd taken a job as a nurse at the Ascension Sacred Heart Hospital, and for a while I'd been very happy there, but I had always felt a deep yearning to return home. I regretfully missed several Christmases and Thanksgivings with my family, and those had been lonely times, when I'd longed to come back home, but my lack of courage had kept me away. I knew things were about to change exponentially for me in leaps and bounds. It would seem that no matter how long you've been away from home, there really is no place in the world quite like it. Golden Sands was one of many houses on the street,
nestled on a hilly incline that overlooked a pristine stretch of beach and the most glorious idyllic oceanfront views that I had appreciated so very much as a child. I had missed all that, being away from Golden Sands for so very long. Sometimes when I lay asleep in bed at night, after a busy shift spent at the hospital, I would see myself as a little girl again, running across the stretch of beach with a bucket and spade in my hand, and my little brother at my side. We would be happily, industriously making sandcastles together. My mother would elegantly be sitting there, stretched out on her beach towel, her head shaded by the umbrella of a wide-brimmed straw hat, wearing a pair of rather glamorous sunglasses. She would sit next to my father on the beach, who would also be stretched out on a beach towel. I think my dad would bring a book along with him. In my mind's eye he was so obscure in my recall, and the harder I tried to focus on memories of him, they would become increasingly more dim. My mother also brought a book along to the beach with her every time. She thoroughly enjoyed reading romantic fiction or detective novels. I always remember she wore bright red lipstick at all times. She would say Marilyn Monroe would never be seen dead without her signature red lipstick anointing her lips, and she was much the same. Sometimes she went to bed at night wearing that bright shade of red lipstick. She would tease that if there was an emergency situation at the house, she still wanted to look her very best. I had little memory of my father, which was something I deeply regretted. By the time I was 7 years old, he died on a building site, where the scaffolding had unfortunately collapsed on top of him in a fortuitous, unforeseen accident, where my father had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, which is always the way with accidents. Regretfully, he'd been put into a medically induced coma after the accident, but his body could not overcome his traumatic brain injury. He never woke up from his coma, and my mother had been forced to allow the hospital to switch off life support. I still cannot imagine what that must have been like for my poor mother at the time. Me and my brother were too young and impressionable to fully appreciate what was happening with our father. One day my mother told me and Andrew that our dad would never be coming back home. "He's with the angels in heaven now." I remember being so angry that my dad had not taken me and Andrew along with him to be with the angels. It seemed like a raw deal to have been left behind like this. For years I'd look up at the heavenlies and wonder if my father was looking down on us. Sometimes I'd even wave at him. When I was older, my mother told me that my father had always known he would die young. He had intrinsically believed he'd never live past 30, and he was right about that. My mother had laughed at him and his faint imaginings, telling him to stop being so ridiculous, and that he'd probably outlive her. When he was a boy, he'd actually done a picture of a stairway to heaven, almost as if he anticipated his early demise, as if it was written in the stars for him. He had said to his own mother, "That's where I'm going when I leave this place," and his words had given my grandmother the chills. My mother had chosen to never marry again, but my father's life insurance policy saw us through any financial challenges that could have presented themselves to us along the way. Luckily, my dad had insisted on taking out all these policies, given his premonitions about an early death, which he didn't take lightly, and also because working on a building site, you make these kind of provisions for your family as a matter of routine, should the worst ultimately happen. The financial burdens over our family were thus lifted. The insurance payouts had carried us over the rocky turbulence of our lives. After my dad died, I don't think my mother was quite the same again. A spark inside her had gone out. She had absolutely no interest in dating other men. She told us that Dad was her soulmate, and replacing him was close to impossible, so she wouldn't even bother to try. I mean, what was the point? She'd rather be alone, she told us. I was glad to be coming home again, and to all the memories that coming home invariably engendered, like the crashing waves that come rolling onto the seashore every second, reminding us that they are never going away. Besides anything else, I needed to be here for my mother. She had never once betrayed my trust when I'd run away from town with very good reason. I'm sure in town they thought I was a terrible person, but I really didn't care about that, or what other people thought of me. My brother was right about that. If we let people's opinions of us dictate our happiness, then happiness would become as elusive as the Scarlet Pimpernel. I had decided after speaking to my brother on that phone call that from now on I was going to stand up for myself and face my demons. After a while, I was sure the mud would finally settle, and hopefully my return home would be like old news. Sooner or later, I would have to face the music over what I'd done, but I'd felt braver and more courageous after listening to Andrew's words of encouragement than ever before. The drive from Pensacola to Portland in my gold Subaru Forester was about 41 hours. I knew if I took the trip slowly with overnight stops and lots of breaks along the way, that it wouldn't be too intimidating a journey. When I got closer to home on Highway 101, which is the quintessential ticket to enjoying the stunning views of the magnificent stretch of coastline, otherwise known as the Pacific Ocean, the curtain of scenery that greeted me at every junction, with a familiarity of note that made me feel rather nostalgic. Indeed, I sensed a burning magnetic pull that was directing me towards my hometown, almost like a homing pigeon can pick up the vibrations that guide it straight back to its roosting place. I could taste the familiar salt in the crisp, cool, bracing sea air, and I bore witness to the dramatic, diverse scenery spread out thickly before me, like butter over a bagel, where habitats can range from open sandy dunes, lush forests, tidal pools, to headwater streams. My car gingerly rolled up the steep incline. I proceeded rather cautiously along my way, drinking in the idyllic scenery that surrounded me, rather like a frothy, delicious, rich, creamy, double-thick chocolate milkshake. I soon pulled up to the familiar red-bricked entranceway of my mother's home, which was one house among many along this street, where all the houses boasted sizable front and back yards, and a perfect stretch of prepossessing ocean-front views. I suddenly felt as if I'd gone back over 7 years in time. The house looked exactly as I remembered it, with pale cream-coloured walls and turquoise-blue shutters that looked as if they'd recently undergone a new lick of paint, as it's easy with the abrasive sea air for things to require regular maintenance to prevent the formidable aggressors such as rust, decay, rot, and the inevitable damp problems that can easily arise living out here. My brother Andrew would have kept the house in reasonably good shape, as he was diligent in keeping on top of things, a trait he had clearly inherited from my late father, who was great at fixing anything that was broken. My mother's house had been custom home built, but on seeing it as I pulled up the driveway, I felt as if I was embracing an old, much-loved friend. It was as if the family home was smiling at me broadly and whispering to me, "Welcome back, Eva! Welcome back! Welcome home, my friend!" And in a strange way, if houses can talk, and if they can hug you in a warm embrace, even if you cannot see it or hear it, that is what I felt was happening to me. I could feel a big tug from the heartstrings, as tears began to involuntarily roll down my cheeks. They took me by surprise, I have to say. I suddenly felt as if my throat was constricting. It had become all dry and parched. It was so good to be back, so incredibly good. I noticed the tall trees on one side of the house had grown exponentially over the last 7 years, so much so they were barely recognizable. They were far more spectacular than I remembered, with boughs proudly bursting with glossy green leaves. The grass that bordered around the front of the house facing the street was green, mown to absolute perfection, along with flower beds bursting with tumbling displays of spring perennials, along with hedges that had been sheared into neat little shapes, and wild rhododendron bushes bursting with blossom. Then there was my mother, wearing her signature bright red lipstick that accentuated the huge smile on her face and her white teeth. She flung open the turquoise front door and was standing there looking at my car, hoping to catch a glimpse of me, but I suspect she was struggling to do so, as she didn't have the greatest eyesight, and for some reason wasn't wearing her glasses. But I could see excitement bristling in her sea-blue-green eyes that almost matched the turquoise of the shutters. For a brief moment I could deceive myself into believing that my mother did not have the beginnings of dementia. She looked exactly as I remembered her 7 years before, but she was possibly a little bit more frail. But then she was now in her 80s, so that is bound to be expected. Once I parked my car and climbed out of the front seat, My mother ran towards me, throwing her arms around me. I collapsed into her arms with a huge hug, as tears continued to spill down my cheeks, dampening my mother's cotton blouse. But she didn't appear to mind that at all. "Oh, sweetheart! Oh, I'm so glad you've finally come. I've missed you so much. You have no idea. Andrew can tell you all about that. It's so good to see you, my love. 7 years is a long time." My mother was wiping back tears. "Dear me, look what you've done to me, Aoife. I haven't cried like this since I was a baby. But don't you worry. They're very happy tears." She held me at an arm's length for a distance. "Let's have a look at you. I want to see if you've changed at all. You're thinner than I remember, love. I do hope you're eating well." "Well, that's the problem with nursing, Mum. You have to eat on the run, and sometimes you miss out on meals." "Well, it explains the weight loss then, dear. But you look healthy, and that's all that matters. My word, I do rather love the highlights in your hair. Very glamorous, I have to say. Your hair's grown a lot. When you left home, it was shoulder length. Now it covers your bust, but I like it very much. And I must say, it does suit your face." My mother led me into the kitchen by the hand and guided me to take a seat at the breakfast nook. "You must sit down, love. You must be absolutely exhausted. You've been driving for 2 days now. I can't imagine a journey like that. You are in need of some refreshments, I'm most sure. Forget about your luggage in the car for a moment. We can bring that all in later. You and I are going to have a nice little chinwag. It's been a long time, and I'm absolutely dying to hear your news." I gratefully sank into the seat of the breakfast nook. My mother proceeded to pour me some homemade lemonade, just like the old days. The lemonade tasted tangy and zesty, exactly as I remembered it. My mother naturally wanted to know all about the life I'd led in Florida for 7 years, even though we'd always been in touch. But hearing everything from the horse's mouth is so much better when it's in person. She wanted to know what it was like working at the local hospital. She asked me so many questions. Finally, she dropped her head rather sorrowfully and said, "Well, I'm sure your brother Andrew has informed you about my rather unfortunate diagnosis." I nodded. I reached out to squeeze my mother's hand. "I'm so sorry, Mum. It must have been so upsetting for you to get a diagnosis like that. But there are things, you know, you can do to improve your memory. I've heard you can take coconut oil. There are alternative protocols you can follow. It's not all bad news. Medicine is advancing." "Well, the truth is, dear, I am getting older every single day, and I'm fully aware of that. And things catch up with you in old age, you know. So something gets you, one way or another, doesn't it? The truth is my memory has been failing me for the last 10 years or so. It's been getting progressively worse, and I've been very aware of that, you know. I went to the doctors, under the insistence of your brother, and underwent a plethora of tests, and the results were not exactly very encouraging. But you know I'm going to try every protocol I can to ensure that I remain as sharp as I possibly can for as long as possible. I suppose you could say I guessed that I was battling some kind of congenital decline. But that's the way it is. Do you know, the other day I woke up and I couldn't remember my own name. It was like when you meet someone for the first time. Well, not for the first time. Someone who you haven't seen for a long time. You wonder who they are. You know them from somewhere, but you can't remember their name exactly. It's not only frustrating, but terribly embarrassing. On that morning I felt that way about my own self, you know. I thought I know what my name is, but I just can't remember it. It scared me half to death, not remembering who I was. You know something, love? It was really tough listening to the doctor's prognosis. I'm not going to kid. He did admit that there will be a day when I might not recognize my own children. Now, can you imagine that? It's very difficult to hear. I dread to think of that happening to me. But you know what? When it does, you must know that on the inside somewhere, I do know you and love you very much. And I don't want you to ever forget that for a single second. You need to promise me that, Eva." "I promise, Mum. I know it's going to be scary, Mum, really scary. I can't begin to imagine what it must have been like for you." "It was terrifying, Eva. You do know when your mind is short-circuiting, you know. Like you know if there's something not right with an electric gadget in your kitchen that begins to spark. On the day I forgot my name, a few minutes later I was right as rain again. I remembered my name straight away. But the forgetfulness has become an annoying botheration for me that I so wish I could swat away like a blowfly. I can do some stupid things at times, Eva, when I lose my memory. Do you know one day when I came back from my shopping, I couldn't find the toiletries I'd bought. I discovered I'd put them in the microwave, and I'd put the new dress I bought in the deep freezer. I searched for these things high and low, couldn't find them anywhere. Your brother found that dress of mine when he was dishing up ice cream for dessert later on in the evening. We had a good old laugh about that when he brought out the stiff dress for me. It may have been funny at the time, but let me tell you it was distressing to say the very least. I mean, what made me put a dress in the deep freeze? God only knows. That's why I'm here, Mum, for you, to help you on this journey. I know it's not going to be easy, but we'll get through it together, I promise. I'm a nurse, so I know what to expect, and I can help you in any way I can. And believe it or not, Mum, it's a gift for me to be here home with you. I wouldn't want it to be any other way, and I promise you I've been longing for this day. I've missed you so much. I'm genuinely thrilled to be back, in more ways than one. Besides, I do need to make amends with the past, and I want to get to know little Chloe. I had to come home for her, not just for you." My mother grabbed my hand and squeezed it tightly. "Of course I'm so thrilled you're here, Eva, with me. I've missed you so terribly much. But I'm concerned about you. Should you really be sacrificing your life on my account? I don't think so. I mean, I don't want you to give up your life for me. Mum, I'm not giving up anything. I'm just so thrilled to be with you again. Well, as for Chloe, now that's an altogether different matter, is it not? It's a rather delicate situation, to say the least. It can't have been easy for you coming back here, Eva, after all this time, and after everything that happened. And also, the way you might be received by some of the locals. Well, it doesn't bear thinking about, does it? Well, I'm not worried about any of that, Mum. Well, you know, dear, people can be vindictively cruel. Some of the spiteful things people said about you after you left were quite deplorable. I remember wishing that I could tell them the truth so that they could put their wiggling tongues to rest. But I couldn't betray your trust, could I, Eva? You'll always be my little girl, no matter what, no matter how old you get. And my maternal need to protect you goes with the territory of being a mother, I'm afraid. Well, I appreciate everything, Mum, and everything that you did at the time, the way you stuck up for me. I cannot thank you enough for that. Oh, you don't have to thank me for anything, Eva. I would do anything for you, you know that. But I do think, in hindsight, that things should have been done differently. But I understand why you did what you did back then. How's Richard? I asked. I understand you have contact with him because of Chloe. Of course I'm regularly in touch with Richard. I see him almost every week. Little Chloe comes twice a week to be here with me. She's such a delightful little girl, she is. You've missed out on so much, love. She's grown so very quickly. They always do at that age, you know. I know I have, Mum. Believe me, I have so many regrets. I can't even begin to tell you about them all. Well, you're here now, love, and that's all that matters. How did Richard take it when I left that note for him all those years ago? You really want to know the answer to that question, love? Well, I'm sure you know it anyway. He was absolutely devastated because Richard adored you. You were his life, his entire world. And he was furious at the same time. He did try to insist I told him exactly where you were. But I told him you needed space and time to yourself, and he couldn't understand why. As I was saying, he's been very good to me about giving me access to Chloe. I will give him that.
Well, that is good of him, but I wouldn't have expected anything less, Mum. It would have been insane for you not to see your granddaughter.
The truth is, Eva, I really don't know how Richard is going to react when he learns you're back in town. I've given the matter a lot of thought, you know. I don't think he's going to receive that news terribly well. I don't believe he's ever forgiven you for leaving him in the lurch like you did, with no explanation whatsoever as to why you left him. It was incredibly tough on him back then. For a long time he was completely lost. My heart went out to him, you know. Let's just say after your divorce, I think he wiped his hands of you completely. I think he may not be very accommodating about allowing you to see Chloe after all this time, although I could be very wrong about the matter, because Richard is a very agreeable person. I think as far as he may be concerned, you forfeited your right to see Chloe, to have a relationship with your daughter, after you walked out on her in the way you did.
Well, I'll cross that bridge when I come to it, Mum. I'm sorry, Mum, but Richard cannot stop me from seeing my little Chloe. He just can't. She's my little girl, and I'm her mother. I naturally want a relationship with her. I know I messed up big time leaving her in the way I did. I know it was a foolish thing to do, and I really regret it. But I wasn't in the right headspace, Mum, back then. Things are different now. I'm in a much better place, and I really want to make amends, and I want Richard to really believe that.
You're going to have to speak to him, love. I'm not sure he's going to be reasonable. But you've been away, you know, for 7 years. That's a long time. You can surely appreciate where he's coming from. I think any trust he had towards you is going to be rather slim, don't you? And apart from anything else, little Chloe has no memory of you, and Richard has not forgiven you for walking away. He doesn't understand any of it, love, or why you up and left him in the way you did. None of it made any sense to him at all, and your leaving little Chloe behind was just such a shock to him. At the very least, he would have expected you to take Chloe with you. In the end, Richard had to raise his little girl all on his own, and that was not remotely easy for him. But he's a great father to your little girl. Of course, I honoured your wishes, Eva. I didn't disclose any of your reasons as to why you left, because I understand it was very delicate. I mean, what was the point anyway? The man was broken up after you abandoned him, and little Chloe in the way you did. There was no point in putting salt into the wound, making things far worse than they already were. But even I thought you'd be back after a couple of weeks, and you would return home. But instead you stayed away for such a long time, love. 7 years is not a short leave of absence by any manner of means. I just couldn't come back, Mum, and you know exactly why. So does Andrew. I didn't keep any of this from you as to why I left. But how could I tell Richard? How could I? I knew the truth might break his heart, and he was broken enough when I left him. He was so in love with little Chloe after she was born. How could I possibly tell him the truth, Mum? I know, love, and what you went through beggars belief. But at the time I think you should have told Richard what was going on. I think he would have understood and given you the space you needed. Maybe he'd have encouraged you to see a shrink or something to help you overcome some of the demons that were tormenting you at the time. I'm not sure he'd have understood, Mum. And for your information, I did get some counselling over my issues when I arrived in Florida, which is why I'm in a better place now, but it's taken a long time to get there. I went to see a therapist called Julia Senderwood. She came highly recommended. It's taken a long time, but Julia has helped me. She's helped me to see the wood for the trees. She's made me see it's important for me to have a relationship with my daughter. She made me see that none of this was my fault. My mother looked at me through her dewy eyes that could not hide the fact that she was delighted to see me again. Your therapist is absolutely right, Eva. None of this was your fault, and I told you that at the time. It was hardly surprising you were insouciant towards little Chloe, given you found out the truth. But I think Richard would have come around in the end. I really do. He loves the bones of little Chloe.
I'm not sure he would, Mum. Men are difficult, you know. You can't always be sure how they're going to react to something. My mother shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly.
Well, you know the past is not like my knitting, that I can go back and correct. More's the shame. The text has already been written, love. The script has been played out. So it is what it is. And there isn't a jelly bean we can do about it. Despite everything, Richard is a jolly good, decent human being. And like you, he didn't deserve any of this to happen. I think now you're back in town, you should tell him the truth, Aoife, about what happened, and why you upped and left the way you did.
I don't think I could, Mum. The truth might destroy him, and sometimes the truth can be a killer. I've seen it at the hospital, where the truth has driven people to attempt the unthinkable, to take their own lives. Had they been ignorant of the truth, they would have lived happily ever after in their ignorance. And in some ways, Mum, that's kinder. Do we always need to know the truth, if it's going to end up destroying us? I don't think so. If I hadn't been hell-bent in knowing the truth myself, I may never have run off the way I did, and Richard and I would still be happily married.
Well, when you put it like that, love, I don't know what to say. But there's method somewhere in the madness, and what you say is true. So who am I to judge? Let's just say I think there are going to be some roadblocks along the way for you, now that you're back in town. Richard is going to need to know you're back. And if he's going to allow you to see little Chloe, he needs to be assured you're not going to hurt his little girl by sauntering off again in the way that you did, that you're here for keeps, and you have no intention of hurting his little girl again. I do think the revelation of your being back is going to go down like a lead balloon with him. And can you blame him for that? I'm sure, Aoife, you are the very last person in the world he wants to see right now. There is one thing you should know, Aoife, and I'm not sure you're going to find this very easy to digest.
Go on, Mum. Tell me. I can practically handle anything now. My mother looked uncomfortable. She shifted rather awkwardly in her seat, and hurriedly topped my glass up with more lemonade, to avoid looking directly in my eyes. My mother hated to say anything to me she knew would sting me. Whatever it was, I'd likely find out about it enough sooner or later, so she might as well tell me what it was.
Well, Richard has moved on with his life, hasn't he, love? It was going to inevitably happen when you moved away. A man like him is not going to remain unattached for terribly long, especially after your divorce came through for both of you in the post. Richard's been with another woman over the last 5 years. He's now engaged to her. Maybe Andrew told you about her already. I rather suspect he has. Richard's fiancée is called Lacey. She's the one who takes care of little Chloe most of the time. And I'm afraid, love, I hate to tell this to you, but Chloe calls her mummy. I know that is very hard to hear, but as far as Chloe is concerned, Lacey is a mother to her. She doesn't know anything about your existence.
I inwardly grimaced. This is not what I wanted to hear. I had heard from my brother that Richard was seeing someone new. That was true. I had brushed that unfortunate news away, like the dust particles on a coat. The idea of my little Chloe not knowing me any more broke my heart, but then she'd never known me. But I did not deserve any better than that, did I? I'd been the one that had walked away from my little girl, and now I was having to have a rude wake-up call. Getting to know my little girl might not be as plain sailing as I had hoped it would be. My little girl was calling another woman mummy. How would I ever be able to weave my way into her life, like a golden thread that doesn't belong in the tapestry, but now insists on making an appearance and being sewn in among the threads, when there's no place for it at all? As I suspected, word about me being back in town went around like a rampant wildfire, and I can only imagine the ugly words that would eventually be spluttered around the place like mud over a windscreen window. It was at the local supermarket
when I was buying some food items to make my mother a homemade meal, that I stumbled into the woman that had been my best friend, until of course I'd left town. Andrea O'Connor just stood there staring at me, as if she'd seen a ghost. Her mouth opened and closed like a startled goldfish, and finally, finding her feet, she marched over towards me defiantly, with a shopping bag in her hand that contained a loaf of bread, a tin of tuna, and a bottle of mayonnaise. Her tone of voice was abrupt and brusque, and I could feel the thorny barbs clinging onto her tongue like a tick on a dog's coat. She intended to spit out venom to me, with a poisonous indignance, but I was ready for it. "Oh, I did wonder when you'd grace us with your presence again, Aoife. I'm impressed. I never thought you'd dare show your face in town again. Not after what you did. Have you really got no shame?" Andrea spat at me contemptuously, as if she'd long since forgotten that at one time we'd been the best of friends, that had walked home together from school every day, and giggled together over the boys we both fancied. No, I could see no nostalgic wistfulness in her eyes, no precious memories from our childhood that softened the blows of her judgmentally condemning words. It was like she'd conveniently forgotten our special friendship that we'd enjoyed together, like you might leave behind your dark glasses on a bus and forget how good a pair they actually were. "It's good to see you too, Andrea," I said sarcastically. "It's been a long time, has it not?" Andrea frowned. "Not long enough as far as I'm concerned. What you did, Aoife, it was deplorable. People in town couldn't get their heads around it. You, Aoife, of all people, walking out on a 6-month-old baby like that. Who does that? It's criminal. What kind of a mother are you? Even if you were suffering from some postnatal depression or whatever they choose to call it, you could have sought help, Aoife. But no, not you. You just swanned off into the sunset, leaving poor Richard in the lurch. You have no idea what you put that poor man through. It was cruel, Aoife, really cruel. And the worst part of it all is Richard loved you so much. You know how lucky you were to have a husband like him. He was incredible. He loved the bones of you. And then you do this to him. How could you, Aoife?" She paused for a brief second to draw breath, and then asked, "Anyway, what are you doing back in town? Why have you come home after all this time? You should have just stayed away." "Well, I'm glad I bumped into you, Andrea," I said rather gingerly. "I know what you think of me, and I don't blame you for that. But I'd like you to remember we were good friends once, and I really need your help." "You need my help, do you?" she scoffed. "That's rich coming from you. How can I possibly help you, Aoife?" "Don't be like that, Andrea. I'm begging you, don't be like that. We were best friends once, remember? I'd like to be friends again if we could. I was actually going to come and see you, but I'm glad I bumped into you like this. So what is this so-called favour you want from me, Aoife, then?" said Andrea, putting her hands on her hips in a defensive gesture and swinging her shopping basket in her free hand backwards and forwards like a pendulum. "I want you to tell Richard I'm in town and that I need to speak to him about Chloe. I want to see my little girl again." "Is this a joke? You want me to speak to Richard for you so you can see little Chloe again? It's a bit too late for that, don't you think? Are you insane, Aoife? Do you have any idea what you did when you up and left that poor man? And your own baby, like they meant absolutely nothing to you? Do you have any idea how broken up Richard was?" "Of course I have an idea. I'm not a monster, you know. You could kid me. He was desperate to find you, Aoife. But your mother only told him you wanted to be left alone and would be fine. He mistakenly thought you'd gone away for a short period of time, that maybe you were suffering from postnatal depression or something, that you had come back. But no, you didn't, did you? You bogged off for 7 whole years, leaving poor Richard to raise Chloe alone. And then you sent him all those divorce papers." I know, don't remind me of all that. But how could you do such a despicable thing, Aoife, to a man that loved you so much? Everyone in town was disgusted with what you did, and rightly so. I thought you were a better person than that, Aoife. Richard has washed his hands of you. He certainly doesn't want to see you again after all this time, I'm most sure. And can you blame him for that? No, I can't, But I have to see my little girl Chloe again. I have to see her again. You have to see little Chloe again, do you? And you've waited 7 long years to see your little girl? That's rich. You broke Richard's heart, Aoife. There's a new woman in his life now. And I hate to tell you this, but Richard is very happy with her. Her name's Lacey, and they're engaged to be married. Chloe is a happy girl these days. They don't need you coming along to set the cat among the pigeons. You walked out on your little girl, leaving Richard in charge of Chloe's care. And now after all this time you want to be part of your little girl's life. You've got a bloody cheek, Aoife. Well, if you refuse to help me, Andrea, by speaking to Richard on my behalf, I said resolutely, then I'm going to go over to his house myself and personally talk to him about little Chloe. I thought you could be the mediator between the two of us and arrange a place where we could meet, a rendezvous perhaps, to discuss my getting to know my little girl again. I thought if he heard I was back in town from you, it would give him time to think about things. Andrea sighed. You've got a nerve, Aoife. I'll give you that. A bloody nerve. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. Richard is not going to be remotely happy to hear you're back in town, after you abandoned him in the way you did. But I guess it's better he hears the bad news from me, so he gets a chance to get his head around it. He's going to be a very unhappy camper, let me tell you. Don't you think I regret everything that happened? If I could turn back the hands of time, I would, but I can't. Regret, said Andrea, spitting at me like a viper. You don't know the meaning of the word regret, do you, Aoife? You really don't. You walk away from a wonderful husband and a beautiful baby girl, and you come back after all these years, expecting people to accept what you did. People around here, Aoife, have got long memories. They don't take kindly to mothers who reject their own babies. I thought I knew you, Aoife. I thought you would make the perfect mother one day. But you showed me that you've got no substance. You're just made up of hot air, aren't you? And to think that you and I were the best of friends for years and years. I invested so much in our friendship, Aoife. And for what? I don't think I ever knew you. Not really. No friend of mine would abandon their own baby. When you left, I didn't hear a dicky bird from you again. It was like you willfully cut me out of your life, as if I didn't matter. It hurt, Aoife. It really hurt. You don't know the half of it, Andrea, so don't be so quick to judge me. Look, I do regret what happened, and even though I cut off communication with you, I did miss you, Andrea, very much. You're very special to me, whether you believe it or not. I did what I did, at the time, to get away from town. Regret, said Andrea, spitting at me like a viper. You don't know the meaning of the word regret, do you, Aoife? That's the problem. You really don't. You had the audacity to walk away from a wonderful husband and a beautiful 6-month-old baby girl. And then you come back after all these long years, expecting people to accept what you did. She shook her head vigorously. People around here have long memories, Aoife. They don't take very kindly to mothers who abandon their kids. I thought I knew you, Aoife. I thought you'd make the perfect mother one day. But you showed me you've got no substance. You're just made up of hot air. That's not fair, Andrea. You know that that's not fair. I think it's very fair. You and I were the best of friends, Aoife, for years and years. I invested so much in our friendship. And for what? I don't think I ever knew you. No friend of mine would abandon their baby like you did. When you left, I didn't hear a dicky bird from you, did I? It was like you willfully cut me out of your life, as if I didn't matter at all. It hurt, Aoife. It really hurt. I'm sure it did, and I'm really sorry about that. But you don't know the half of it, Andrea. You really don't. So please don't be so quick to judge me. Look, I seriously regret what happened. And even though I cut off all communication with you, I did miss you. You were always a special friend to me, Andrea, whether you believe it or not. But I did what I did to get away from town. I had to get away from town. I need you to believe that. I had my reasons. Well, I hope you had a good reason, Aoife, for leaving your husband and baby girl. Because I want to believe that. I really do. But I'm struggling to. I pulled open my purse and thrust a card in Andrea's hands. That's my cell phone number, Andrea. Give me a call on how to proceed from here. In regards to seeing Richard, please speak to him on my account. Tell him I really need to see little Chloe. And tell him I'm very sorry about the chaos that I caused and what I put him through. I didn't mean to hurt him. Andrea stiffened. She studied me through hard, judgmental, cold eyes, and then glanced briefly down at the card. "Why did you leave town, Aoife?" she asked me again, her voice suddenly softening. "I don't understand, Aoife. Why would you leave such a beautiful husband and baby girl? Why would you cut everybody out of your life, apart from your mother and brother? I just don't get it. I really don't." Believe me, Andrea, when I say there's some things it's better you don't know, I mean it. I did have good reason. That's all I need you to know. Andrea's mouth dropped open as I promptly marched out of the store, leaving my shopping basket behind me, tears rolling in a flurry down my cheeks. I certainly didn't want to give Andrea the satisfaction of seeing me like this. I had known that meeting some of the townsfolk after all this time would be grievously hard, but Andrea had been my very best friend, and seeing the despicable resentment and hatred in her eyes that she wilfully subjected towards me was more than I could bear. It was brutal. I returned to my car and sat there in the front seat, having a jolly good cry. I was very grateful my car was ambiguously obscured by a large overhanging tree, so any passing inquisitive shoppers returning to their cars with trolleys loaded up with groceries could not see the strange woman blubbering her eyes out in her car. I'm glad to say the tears brought me a measure of release. It had been a long time since I'd cried my heart out like this. My therapist, Mrs. Senderwood, had told me I needed a good cry, but until now the river banks of my tear ducts had been like a dry, arid desert, where no water could be found, until the heavens finally opened. I suspected that these were long, belated tears of grief, as coming home had made me all too well aware of what I'd lost. But the memories of that tumultuous day, when I went for a casual stroll on the beach, came rolling back to me like the waves on the seashore. I couldn't ignore them, for they began flashing in my mind in a vivid imagery. My heart began to palpitate as I lived through the moment that had changed my life forever. 9 years earlier, or thereabouts. I was in a happy place in my life at this point in time. In truth, I couldn't have been happier. I was a married woman, laying down roots with my husband Richard. Richard had been my first love. The two of us were as thick as thieves. We had an enviable relationship, and by the time I was only 18 years old, it was a given to everyone that knew us that Richard and I would one day get married. Richard had never given another woman a fleeting glance. The same could be said for myself when it came to members of the opposite sex. It seemed incomprehensible and inconceivable to imagine the two of us could ever split up or live our lives apart. At this point in time, Richard and I were living at Golden Sands with my mother, my brother, and his wife. Golden Sands was where I'd grown up as a girl. Me and Richard were waiting for the house we had designed together, after we got married, to be built. But there were some issues with the planning for the home that was holding up the project from coming into fruition. So we were staying at Golden Sands indefinitely with my mother, while we waited for our house to be built. Naturally, we couldn't wait to gain our own independence as a married couple by owning our own home. And as is often the case, when taking a project on your own, things can sometimes go pear-shaped. Beyond the house we were building, me and Richard were both very eager to become parents. We talked about little else. I was longing to become a mother. Furthermore, my own mother was encouraging us to have a child, telling us she couldn't wait to be a grandmother, and we should hurry up and start having babies. I didn't need any further encouragement. I would have been happy to have had a baby yesterday, if I had any say in the matter. But my prayers to God always seemed to come back empty-handed. There were no buns cooking in my oven. Ostensibly I'd been trying to fall pregnant for the last 2 years or so, and it had come to the point that me and Richard became increasingly frustrated by our continuous disappointments every month, when it was gleaned that once again I was still not pregnant. I didn't think I had the stomach to undergo any more setbacks. We both knew we needed the matter investigating by a specialist, as I had a horrible deep guttural feeling that I might be infertile. I automatically assumed any plumbing issues in that department had to be female-related, as women had much more complicated apparatus than men did, so it seemed a given that we both thought the issue was with me. Richard had kindly assured me that we could go down the route of IVF treatments if I continued to struggle to conceive. "Don't blame yourself, sweetheart," he told me. "There are lots of couples in our predicament that struggle to conceive. We will get through this together, I promise you. One way or another, we're going to have a baby." It was when the doctor had tested us both that I was expecting the blame to be firmly laid at my door. I wondered if the doctor was going to tell me that there was something very wrong with me, and that I was incapable of ever having children. The thought filled me with dread. Dr. Ian Fondelay looked from me to my husband. His eyes finally settled on Richard for longer than they had on me. "I'm glad to tell you both that there is absolutely nothing wrong with you. You are both perfectly capable of having children. But your battle to conceive may be harder for you than most people. But I'm sure we shall get there in the end. The main thing is don't worry about it. Worry is very destructive, you know. It will kill your chances of conception every single time. You see, getting pregnant is also an emotional and spiritual thing. It's not just physical." "So we don't need IVF treatment?" I asked the doctor, looking heartily relieved, as I considered the expensive repercussions of such an investment. "If you're not having success in the long term, then yes, IVF treatment can be a route we will consider. But at this point I wouldn't rush things if I were you. Nor would I get embroiled with unnecessary expenses. You're both young, and there's time on your side. And you, Aoife, have some quality eggs. As I was saying, there is absolutely no reason why you should not fall pregnant. But it's a bit of a waiting game, where patience will be needed." "So there's nothing wrong with me then, doctor? I am capable of having a baby, am I?" "Oh, there's nothing wrong with you at all, Aoife. As I was saying, Mrs. Douglas, you've got plenty of good quality eggs." My husband sat there in silence. Slowly he caught the doctor's eye. "Is the problem with me, doctor? Why do I get the strange feeling that it is?" "In a manner of speaking, Mr. Douglas, you could say that the ball rests firmly in your court. But there is nothing that you need to worry about. Indeed, if you worry, it will make the problem significantly worse. Stress and worry can wreak havoc on your sperm count. I've seen it often enough in my practice. Believe me, there are a lot of men in your unfortunate situation, Mr. Douglas, but it is a situation that can be amended and changed. I'm afraid at this point in time, your sperm count is rather poor. But your condition is not written in stone. Things will change for the better. At least I can say you don't have low testosterone. You don't have chromosomal defects or an undescended testicle, nothing like that. You have none of those shortcomings. You are perfectly healthy, I'm glad to say. What we have here, I suspect, is all stress and lifestyle related. Once we fix that, we fix the problem. Maybe trying to get your wife pregnant, Mr. Douglas, is creating anxiety. Things like that can reduce your sperm count. It's not just a physical thing, you see. It's also mental. I do understand that the two of you are building your own home, and that's bound to cause undue stress. Believe me, I know about that." My husband looked as if someone had thrown a brick at his head, for no man wants to hear he has a low sperm count, as it can feel quite demasculating, and my husband did not receive the news terribly well. "Mr. Douglas, please don't be too upset about this," said the doctor, sensing my husband's obvious despondency. "These days, I'm afraid, a lot of men suffer from a low sperm count. As I keep saying, changes to your diet, exercise regime, and lifestyle habits can make a consequential difference to sperm count. I see men in your position all the time. All it means with less sperm being around is that the chances are slimmer for your wife to fall easily pregnant. But that doesn't mean that she won't. A lot of women have fallen pregnant despite their husband's low sperm count, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. You will probably find if you go away on holiday and relax, bingo, your wife will fall pregnant faster than you can say Jack Robinson. As I say, I see this all the time. Forget about trying too hard to get pregnant. and let it just happen naturally. I had one couple in my offices over a year ago. They had similar problems in conceiving. They eventually decided to adopt a child. They stopped worrying about trying to get pregnant, and lo and behold, it happened. I can't underestimate how stress will hijack your chances of success every time. When me and my husband walked away from the appointment, Richard was very upset, blaming himself for being the reason I hadn't fallen pregnant yet. He made every effort to enhance his health in order to improve my chances of conceiving successfully. I would one day soon fall pregnant, but me and my husband Richard had no way of knowing that fate had other ideas for us that would turn our lives quite literally upside down. It all began one fine summer's evening, after dinner at my mother's house. Or you could describe it as late afternoon, as it wasn't exactly dark yet. I thoroughly enjoyed eating an evening meal with Andrew, his wife, and my mother at Golden Sands. I still recall exactly what we had for dinner that night. My mother had prepared a mouth-watering chicken and mushroom tagliatelle, my all-time favourite meal, served with French salad and garlic bread. It's amazing what you can recall when a period of time is deeply imprinted on your mind, like a photograph that cannot be erased. I still recall the vivid smells, tastes, and even conversations we had together that night. They seem to be permanently entrenched in my memory, like the firm cement that has finally set after a building project has been completed, leaving behind an imprint in the cement that simply cannot be swiped away. That night the food was absolutely delicious, a little heavy perhaps on the stomach, so working it off with some exercise was on the cards for me. It seemed like a great idea, especially after the doctor had encouraged us to take more exercise. I decided to take a leisurely stroll on the beach. It was 6 o'clock and still reasonably light outside, although by 7:30 it would invariably be dark. Nobody batted an eyelid when I left for a walk, as I did every day, like clockwork after dinner. As in this part of the world, it always felt safe walking on your own. Although I do recall remarking to my mother that in the last week or so, I had felt as if I was being watched when I went out for my regular walk, which my mother pooh-poohed as being all in my imagination. Oh, honestly, Aoife, you really are the end, you know. Don't give anxious thoughts like that any credence. Of course nobody's watching you. The beach is very secluded, and anybody on it is probably just local. I very much doubt anybody is watching you. You need to block out those negative imaginations of yours. That kind of thinking can bring on all manner of anxiety disorders. And I certainly don't want that happening to you, love. The last thing we need is for you to go on anxiety medication. You must stop worrying about Richard's sperm count, for goodness sake. If you allow your nervous energy to consume you, then falling pregnant will almost certainly elude you. It doesn't matter how many times you walk up and down the beach with little Snoopy. It's not going to make any difference until you master your mind. And when you do that, you'll be pregnant sooner than you know how to say Jack Robinson. At the time, my mother had a beagle called Snoopy, who loved coming for regular walks with me. I would take him in the mornings and the late afternoons or early evenings, and little Snoopy was under the mistaken impression that although he was my mother's beloved dog, that he belonged to me. I loved that dog like no other dog on this entire planet. He was incredibly special to me, so well behaved, and just an all-round great companion. It was a spectacularly beautiful evening, as I happily trotted out onto the beach with Snoopy by my side. I really enjoyed these late afternoon walks after dinner. I eagerly discarded my slip-slops after I descended the steep stone steps that were built into the hillside, so that I could thoroughly enjoy my walk bare feet on the soft sea sand that massaged my toes and was still pleasantly warm to the touch. I'd also enjoy the cool foamy water that would bathe my feet at regular intervals. Me and Snoopy walked across the sand together, leaving behind us a trail of imprints that would soon be washed away by the rambunctious water. I was wearing black leggings at the time and a cool cotton pink top that fell above my knees like a short dress. It was pleasingly warm. There wasn't a solitary soul in sight. Snoopy ran ahead of me, running towards the waves, chasing after them as they rolled towards the shore. Together we sashayed towards the vast congregation of sculptural rocks clustered together in voluptuous formations, and where the waves eagerly whipped against them. In the furthest distance, a lush green wood-grove of trees framed the cul-de-sac at the far end of the beach. The walk to the cul-de-sac was a good 25 minutes or so. If I was to take a very long walk, then I might decide to walk through the trees to get to another beach. But on this occasion my energy reserves were rather depleted, and my stomach still remained rather full after supper. So as I reached the end of the beach, when I was about to turn around to make the return journey back to Golden Sands, I was suddenly gripped with a great feeling of uncertainty. The feeling grabbed me forcefully, so much so that all I wanted to do was to run across the beach back to Golden Sands as quickly as I could. It was almost as if I could smell danger on the wind, rather like a deer might cautiously pick up the smell of a coyote and get the hell away as fast as it could. Let's just say I knew that something was decidedly off, although I didn't know quite what it was. It certainly didn't help, of course, that Snoopy began to bark fiercely at the woods, as if he had gleaned that there was something there that he didn't like at all. That was when I saw the man running towards me. I'd never seen him before. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out to me. "Excuse me, ma'am. Do you have a cigarette? I really need a smoke." I stared in bewilderment at the stranger. He looked to be a rather normal young man, roughly around about my age, but I'd never seen him before, and the way he darted out of those woods towards me was rather predatory. It had scared the life out of me, but surely he was only harmless. Soon the stranger had caught up with me. He appeared to be standing only inches away from me, and close up I didn't like his appearance at all. There was something so soulless about his dark eyes, and the clothes that he was wearing looked like they hadn't been changed in a whole week. The man had stubble on his chin, and he smelt slightly of booze, although he didn't appear to be very drunk. Snoopy was growling at him furiously, and he was by nature a friendly dog, so his growling was rather uncharacteristic for such a good-natured canine friend. So I took his growling as a warning. There was something insidious about this stranger. He set my nerves on edge. "Sorry," I said quickly, waving my arms around in a dismissive gesture. I turned around to walk away from the stranger as quickly as I could. "I'm afraid I don't smoke, and I don't have any cigarettes on me." "Ma'am, please stop. I just need a moment of your time," the man called after me, running up to me again. I stopped briskly in my tracks and turned around to look directly at him. He was seriously beginning to annoy me. "Do you have any spare change?" he asked me. "No," I said. "I'm sorry, I don't carry spare change with me. I'm walking my dog on the beach. I don't carry money with me." I hurriedly turned around, with Snoopy dashing ahead of me. I didn't want to run away, because that would expose my uncertainty and my vulnerability, rather like a translucent dress that leaves little to the imagination. I didn't want this young man to know that he had ruffled my feathers and made me feel very disquieted. If a predator can sense your vulnerability, it makes you become an easy target. I was very much alone on this sequestered beach, and very much aware of it. I only had Snoopy for company. It was regretfully beginning to grow dark, as splashes of golden orange light lit up the horizon and dappled the ocean with a silvery glaze. But that, too, was fading away. I needed to get away from this man as quickly as I possibly could. He was probably completely harmless, I told myself, but a tiny, still small voice in the back of my head made me feel otherwise. "Walk as fast as you can. Don't run. Don't you dare run," the voice told me. I fought against this internal dialogue, as all I really wanted to do was to run away as fast as I possibly could. My heart thundered violently in my chest, and the blood boomed in my ears. Indeed, it was so loud it blocked out the sound of the crashing waves, thunderously beating against the rocks. To my horror, the man continued to run by my side. "Are you rude or something, ma'am? Did you not hear what I asked you? Have you got some change for me, so I can buy some cigarettes? I'm desperate. I need a smoke." I was startled that the man should ask me this. I shrugged my shoulders nonchalantly, as if what he was asking me was completely normal. "I told you. I'm sorry. I haven't got any cigarettes, nor have I got any change. Now please will you go away? My dog doesn't like strangers. You can see he's growling at you." Before I could do anything, the man lunged towards me with one powerful hand, thrusting me back onto the sea sand, and then I could feel the cold metal of a knife at my throat. Snoopy began to bark incessantly, jumping up at the man and trying to nip the back of his leg, and that didn't go down at all well with him as he kicked back. "Tell your dog to shut up, to stop nipping me, or I'll kill him. Get that bloody thing off me, or I'll chop him up into pieces. Do you understand?" "Snoopy! Snoopy! Stay right there! Stay, Snoopy! Stay!" Snoopy sat down obediently on the beach, waiting for the man to finish his business with me, although I could hear him whimpering. I don't think he understood what was going on. I knew I needed to obey this man if I wanted to come through this ordeal alive. I do recall there was a jagged, ugly scar running down his cheek, and there were pockmarks on his face that suggested at one time when he was younger he might have had an issue with acne. I noticed his fierce, hooded, dark eyes were full of a vindictive hatred. He seemed to be like a misogynist that absolutely abhorred women and had a vendetta against the female species. I knew this attack was all about exerting his power and dominance over me, so that I would feel helpless and wretched. That's exactly what he wanted. The man began to ruthlessly pull off my leggings. He ripped them off like a pair of scant tights. I closed my eyes tightly as the rape began. It was almost as if my consciousness floated out of my body while this was all transpiring, as if I was watching the event up in the sky as I looked down on myself, almost as if it was happening to somebody else that was not me. I have heard that this often happens to victims of rape, and even people who prostitute their bodies for a living. They just physically disconnect as they abandon their physical bodies while they're being exploited. I whimpered out in pain. The man was pulling my hair back so hard that it rarely hurt. He pinned his lips to my ear and whispered, "Shut up, you bitch! If you dare scream, I'll slice your neck open. Do you understand, bitch? I'll leave you to die, to bleed out on this beach." The man continued to rape me, and I completely disengaged from the experience, almost as if I was not on the beach, in my own body, nor was I being dominated by this man's formidable hold. It was as if I was somewhere else. But suddenly my thoughts were interrupted by this loud screaming. "Put me down! Put me down! Stop! Help! Help!" The man sounded beside himself with absolute terror, as if he was the one that was now being attacked. I realized that he'd released his formidable hold from me. I could no longer feel the cold metal of the knife against my neck, and I was wondering why. I sat up with a start, looking rather bemused. Snoopy ran hurriedly over to me, throwing himself into my arms, licking me all over with his pink tongue, as if I was a popsicle. I knew he was trying to comfort and console me, for he knew I'd been attacked on the beach by this insidious, unsavoury character. The man was screaming, "Put me down! Help! Help! Help!" The knife he'd been holding had fallen onto the beach sand. I hurriedly reached out to grab it and threw it into the ocean, where it was submerged by the waves. I looked up to see my attacker was now about 7 foot in the air, dangling precariously from the arms of a powerful creature. I rubbed my eyes. Was I seeing this right? I realized the creature holding the man in the air was a male Bigfoot. He was enormous. He took my breath away. He was built like an army tank, with formidable shoulders and a powerful ripped body, that he would have been quite literally a Goliath among men. He was covered in cinnamon-coloured hair, and his face rather reminded me of an Indian warrior, with those typical high cheekbones and deep-set, dark-hooded eyes. The man who attacked me was wiggling and kicking his legs and arms around and screaming out for the Bigfoot to put him down. I watched in absolute awe as the Bigfoot ran directly into the water with the man in his arms, and I could see the large creature holding him under the water. The man thrashed about, trying to fight against the powerful, forceful hold of the Bigfoot. But the wrestling soon stopped, and then the Bigfoot let go of the man, and his body seemed to bob up and down in the water. I knew he was dead. I felt no remorse for him whatsoever. The Bigfoot walked out of the water towards me. I noticed he'd only got wet up to his knees. The creature sashayed over to me, and then he sat down next to me on the beach, almost as if we were long-lost old friends. I could hear his breathing, see the rise and fall of his chest, which was oddly comforting for me. I sat there, feeling very much at ease with the Bigfoot by my side, and with Snoopy cuddled up in my arms. I stared out at the waves and watched the body of the dead man bobbing up and down in the water, like a log. It really was a surreal feeling. My leggings lay across the beach sand, like a pair of black stockings. I only had on my loose cotton pink shirt. At least I had some modesty left. Soon it began to get dark, but I remained seated next to the Bigfoot. We watched the ocean together, and I stroked Snoopy, and nothing was said, nor was anything needed to be said. My dog went over to the Bigfoot and began to lick his hands, and I remember the Bigfoot chuckled, looking up at me through twinkling eyes, and he also stroked my dog. I smiled at the Bigfoot warmly. I do not know why I felt so at ease in his company, but I did. I didn't even thank him for coming to my rescue, but I just continued to sit there. It was almost as if I was coming to terms with the aftershock of what had happened to me. The Bigfoot seemed to understand this. He reached over to me and patted me gently on the arm, like he'd done with my dog moments before. I think the Bigfoot was encouraging me to get up and to go back home. I reluctantly rose to my feet, and with only my top on, I carried my leggings in my hand. The Bigfoot continued to walk by my side until I reached the hilly slope where I'd left my slip-slops. I needed to take the stone steps up the hill, and then I would be in the yard of our property. The Bigfoot nodded at me, and then I watched him turn around and run down the beach, and he ran so gracefully, like a fast-moving wind, until he was all but a dot on the horizon. I was so desperately grateful he'd come to my rescue, and I thought nothing of the deceased corpse now floating in the water. I know it sounds strange, but even though no words were spoken between me and the Bigfoot, it was as if thousands of unseen words had been communicated between the two of us, as if the Bigfoot knew my every thought. When I arrived back at the house, I observed my mother, my husband, sister-in-law and brother were all laughing madly as they watched a television program together. It was clearly a comedy of some kind. I was certainly not going to join them under any circumstances. I slipped clandestinely into the house and went to the on-bathroom suite of our bedroom. I scrubbed myself in the shower so hard that every trace of that man was rinsed off me. My encounter with him made me feel filthy dirty. I had decided that no one must ever know what had happened to me. I was young, callow, and very naive at the time, far too afraid to tell anyone about the stranger on the beach that had raped me. In some ways I blamed myself for what had happened, and I'm not exactly sure why, because I was innocent of everything. I'm sure other victims of such insidious crimes feel exactly like I did at the time, which is why I believe so many rapes are not reported. All you want to do is wash yourself as rigorously as you can, to get rid of the person that attacked you. You also want to forget that the incident happened at all. Furthermore, the last thing you want to do is to humiliatingly go to the police and have your body prodded as DNA evidence is extracted from you. The truth was the man that had attacked me was now thankfully dead, and I was grateful to the Bigfoot. So as far as I was concerned, I wanted to put this all behind me. By the time my husband had returned to bed that night, I was fast asleep, thanks to a couple of sleeping tablets I had taken, because there is no way I would have got to sleep without them. Snoopy was lying between my legs.
The following morning when I woke up, the events of the previous night came flooding back to me. For a brief moment I wondered if it had all just been a hideous nightmare, but the burning pain between my legs told me otherwise.
"Are you all right, dear?"
my mother asked me when I came into the kitchen the following morning.
"You didn't join us last night when you came back from your walk on the beach. We were watching a wonderful comedy on television. It was terribly funny. Richard said he found you fast asleep in the bed, cuddled up to Snoopy. I was rather worried about you. It's not like you to just bog off to bed like that, without even wishing any of us good night before you go."
"Oh," I shrugged my shoulders. "I just guess I was just very tired."
"Well, as long as that is all it was, love. If you don't mind my saying, you look rather peaky. In fact, your face looks terribly white. I hope you're hungry, dear. I'm making blueberry pancakes for breakfast, and by the looks of you, you could do with something to eat."
"Sounds lovely," I said, trying to sound upbeat, but the last thing on my mind was food. Moments later my brother came into the kitchen.
"Ah, something smells jolly good in here,"
he said, giving me a wink.
"It's your favourite, love," said my mother. "I'm making pancakes with maple syrup and crispy bacon, just the way you like it." "Mum, you're the best," said my brother. "No wonder me and the wife moved in with you. Nothing beats one of your great breakfasts," he said,
giving my mother a cheeky nudge.
"Honestly, Andrew," said my mother, "you are the end."
Before long we were all gathered around the table. My husband Richard was sitting next to me at the breakfast nook. He got a text on his cell phone and began to read it.
"You're not going to believe it,"
he said, taking a sip of his orange juice.
"A dead body has been recovered, washed up on the beach around here." "A dead body?" said my mother, sounding aghast. "Are you sure?"
I inwardly winced when I heard this news. I knew the dead body was of the stranger that had attacked me the previous night.
"No, I'm not joking. Pearson Galloway went for a late-night stroll on the beach. He was suffering from insomnia again. That's when he observed the body floating in the water. At first he thought it was a log, but with a flashlight he got a closer look and observed a face. He got the shock of his life. He found a deceased man, wearing a red T-shirt and black shorts. There was no identification on him, but he must have been a smoker. There was a wet box of cigarettes in his pocket." "Poor, poor man," said my mother. "The water is freezing cold. He could have easily caught hypothermia."
I never told my family members what I knew, but the body recovered on the beach, which became a John Doe, as no one knew who he was. They didn't know where he came from, and there was no man fitting his description that had been reported missing. So the man I'd encountered on the beach remained an enigmatic mystery that would not be discovered for many years. Maybe I would never know who he was, and I was all right with that. Sometimes the less you know about something, the better. It was shortly after this unfortunate incident, when I'd been cruelly raped by this man, who didn't deserve to be called human, that I was to discover I was pregnant. I remember that when I took the pregnancy test for the first time in my life, I was hoping with all my heart it would read not pregnant. The 2 blue lines confirmed my very worst fears. Tears spilled down my cheeks. What if that man on the beach had made me pregnant? It didn't bear thinking about. I remember it took me 3 weeks to summon up the nerve to tell Richard the news. "You're pregnant? Are you sure about this?" he asked me. "I'm sure," I nodded, showing him the 2 blue lines of the pregnancy test. Richard's eyes grew round as saucers as he read the test results, and insisted I took 2 more pregnancy tests to be absolutely sure that I was indeed pregnant. And when they were all confirmed, he swooped me up in his arms with delight. I don't think I'd ever seen him look more happy. "You have made me a very happy man, sweetheart. You are pregnant. Fancy that. We're about to have a baby, and I couldn't be more delighted." "But what would you have done, Richard?" I asked him, "if we couldn't have a baby at all? Supposing it was impossible physically for me to get pregnant, what then?"
Richard thought about the question for a moment. Well, you know what? I wouldn't be adverse to adopting. But thank God we don't have to explore that avenue. I was relieved when Richard said this to me, because it meant he was prepared to love a baby that might not actually be his, and the less he knew about the matter, the better. I had done researches online and discovered that many men were raising children that they believed were their own. I just knew that I could never tell Richard our baby could be the progeny of another man. The thought of it just did not bear thinking about. Do you know what, love? When the doctor told me my sperm count was poor, I was very offended by the whole thing. But you know what? I've obviously changed by transforming my lifestyle, improving my eating habits, embarking on a rigorous exercise program. So I suspect I've improved my sperm count exponentially. It was true that our doctor assured Richard that the positive changes he had made had ensured that I had fallen pregnant. Did I not tell you, Mr. Douglas? If you took better care of yourself, you would get this lovely wife of yours pregnant. And it seems I was not wrong about that. I could only hope clandestinely in my heart that the beloved baby I was carrying inside me did not belong to the insidious John Doe character that wantonly attacked me on the beach that day. I couldn't tell Richard about what had happened to me that evening. I refused to allow myself to even think of the incident, as such ominous memories brought back dark flashbacks that would send me into a panic. Everyone was beyond delighted that I was pregnant. When my beautiful baby girl was born, it was love at first sight for me and my husband Richard. He was absolutely thrilled with our brand new baby. We decided to call our little girl Chloe. When I looked into her beautiful face, I saw absolutely no trace of the monster that had raped me on the beach. No, she had to be Richard's child. I was certain of it. I refused to believe otherwise. At that time, me and my husband Richard had left Golden Sands, so we were no longer living with my mother, with my brother, and his wife. Instead, we'd moved into our designer house we had built, where we had prepared the most perfect nursery for our little girl, in pink. My only regret was it was about a 10-minute drive to the beach, so I very much missed my childhood home. "Oh, goodness gracious me!" Richard's mother had said when she first laid eyes on little Chloe. "She looks just like you, Richard dear. Oh, goodness gracious, Chloe's got your eyes and your hair and your cute little dimples. She takes after you, Richard. You look just like her when you were born." I remember thinking to myself that the man on the beach who attacked me had sandy-coloured hair and dark brown eyes. My little girl did not. I began to persuade myself that Chloe was indeed Richard's little girl, and the relief I felt about this conviction was immeasurable. I could not have stomached it at all if I had believed otherwise. I was going to be a great mother to little Chloe, and a loving wife to my husband Richard, whom I loved more than life itself. I was going to put this miserable event that had happened to me on the beach behind me, and pretend it never had occurred. My mother-in-law's persuasive words had been like sweet music to my ears. Of course my baby was Richard's. The monster on the beach had not impregnated me with his rancid sperm. I watched Richard cradling my baby in his arms, his face lighting up like a lighthouse. It was so bright with the adoration he felt towards little Chloe, and I was equally in love with her, until I wasn't. In a moment of brazen courage, when Chloe was about 6 months old, something made me send off for a DNA test, because one way or another I needed to absolutely ensure that the monster that attacked me on the beach was in no way my little child's father. I felt so confident that Chloe was Richard's progeny. It was true, she looked exactly like him, but I needed to know the truth. When the DNA results arrived in the post, I surreptitiously locked myself in the bathroom, as I couldn't allow anyone to see what I was getting up to. With trembling fingers and a thumping heart, I attempted to open the envelope several times, but my hesitancy consumed me. What if Chloe is not Richard's child? I thought. What then? Then I heard a voice in my head saying, "Of course she's Richard's child." Eventually, in a moment of fleeting boldness, I savagely ripped open the envelope, and when I discovered Richard was not the father of little Chloe, I began to physically fall apart at the seams. It couldn't be true. It just couldn't. I couldn't cope with the revelation. It was like I'd been run over by a forklift truck. In the days that followed, I could only look at my girl with disgust. She was the progeny of a monster. I realized in that moment I needed to get as far away from little Chloe as I possibly could, which was why I abandoned Richard and little Chloe and quickly moved to Florida. I did, however, call my mother to tell her what was going on. She was in total shock about the whole thing. "Ma'am, just so you know, I'm leaving Richard and Chloe. I don't know how long I'm going to be away for, but I can't bear to look at Chloe without feeling violently sick," I told her. "Goodness gracious, love. It sounds as if you've got postnatal depression. Those feelings you are having are perfectly normal. You can get treatment and medication for the condition. I promise you that, love. You'll feel much better. You can't possibly leave Chloe and Richard like this. They mean the world to you. I'll take you to the doctor myself. Everything's going to be absolutely fine, I promise you that." "I'll never feel fine, Mum. I will never feel fine. This is not depression." "You don't know that for sure, my love. You can go and see a specialist and a psychologist. We'll get this nipped in the bud, I promise you, and you'll feel so much better about it all." "Mum, there is something I haven't told you. Something really, really bad." "You're scaring me, darling. What have you done?" "I haven't done anything, Mum. But this concerns Chloe." "What do you mean, love? What do you mean it concerns Chloe? I do wish that you wouldn't speak in riddles like you do." "Mum, I don't know how to tell you this, but Chloe's not Richard's baby." "But of course she's Richard's baby, love. You only have to look at her to know she's Richard's little girl. Where is all this absurd stuff coming from?" "Mum, it's true. Chloe isn't Richard's baby." There was an awkward silence at the end of the line, and my mother's quiet voice said, "You didn't, did you, love? You wouldn't, would you?" "You mean, did I have an affair? Did I cheat on Richard? Of course not, Mum. You know me better than that. It's not in my nature to cheat." "Well, there you go, love. You have your answer then. Chloe is Richard's baby." "No, she's not, Mum. She's not Richard's baby. That's the problem. She's not." "Well, whose baby is she then, love? Excuse me for being a tad confused, but you're not making any sense." Mum, I was raped." "You were what, love? Say that again." "I was raped, Mum." "But I don't understand, love. When were you raped? This can't be right. It just can't. When did this happen to you, love?" "Do you remember the day that a dead body was washed up onto the beach? Do you remember that day, Mum?" "Well, how could I forget it, love? It does rather stick in the memory, doesn't it? You're talking about the John Doe the police are trying to still identify." "The very same. That dead man. He raped me, Mum." "He what?" asked my mother. "You heard me, Mum. That John Doe raped me on the beach. Chloe is his little girl." "No, that can't possibly be true, love. Please tell me this is some kind of warped joke of yours, because if it is, I don't find it remotely funny, love. You're not pulling my leg, are you?" "Mum, I wish I was, but it's true. I've got the DNA test to prove that Chloe is not Richard's, and I haven't been with any other man except the man that raped me. So isn't it obvious whose baby she is?" "You were raped, love. Why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you go to the police at once to report the crime? Why did you not tell me what happened to you? I'm very disappointed, dear. I'm your mother, for goodness sake. You were raped. You need emotional support, love. But I'm always here for you. You know that you can always talk to me about anything. Mum, I couldn't even admit what happened to myself, let alone you, and least of all Richard. I felt so dirty. I felt disgusting. I just couldn't go to the police. I didn't want to think about this anymore. I wanted to obliterate it from my memory, from my mind. It would have been easier to put it behind me if Chloe was Richard's girl. Calm down, love, calm down. This is not the end of the world. Chloe is a beautiful little girl. And even if she is the progeny of a monster, that doesn't make her one. We'll sort this out, don't you worry. But I still believe you need to get justice, don't you? The evil monster that raped you should be put behind bars, locked away for good. Men like him do not deserve to draw any breath. Ma'am, for goodness sake, the man is dead. Have you forgotten that? My mother was silent for a brief moment. Then in a soft voice she said, Of course he is dead, isn't he? Do you know how he died, love? You didn't, did you? I mean, I wouldn't blame you, of course, if you did. It would be regarded as self-defense. Every court in the land would be on your side in regards to that. Ma'am, for goodness sake, I didn't kill him, if that's what you're thinking. The man was huge. I only weigh 120 pounds. He was at least twice my size. He attacked me with a knife, which I threw into the ocean. Well, how did he die exactly, love? How did he manage to die on that beach? They found him floating in the waves. The cause of death was drowning. A Bigfoot killed him, Mum. A what, love? Now, is this some kind of a joke? No, I'm being deadly serious, Mum. A Bigfoot killed my attacker. 1 minute he was all over me, raping me. The next minute he was screaming for help. I looked up to see him dangling in a male Bigfoot's arms, screaming for his life. The Bigfoot treated him like a cockroach, Mum, that needed to be exterminated. He literally took the man into the seawater, submerged him under the ocean waves, and I watched him die. Then that Bigfoot sat with me on the beach until I managed to compose myself. Mum, he was incredible. He didn't say anything to me. He didn't talk. We just sat together. He came to my rescue. Even Snoopy liked him and licked his fingers. Oh, it was just so wonderful what he did for me, Mum. He walked home with me. I felt like I'd been rescued by an angel. Oh, goodness gracious me. I don't know how to react to any of this, love. This is all too much to handle. Think about it, dear. Not all angels that come to our rescue have to have a halo or wings. Angels can come to us from God in many guises, you know. This Bigfoot was clearly an angel to you. That evil man could have killed you, love. Disposed of you in the waves, sliced your neck. I can't bear to think about any of this. I don't think my heart can stand it. Mum, Richard can never know about this. Do you understand? It'll destroy him. I need to leave home for a while. Get my head around this, Mum. I need you to keep the secret from me. Promise you will. Sweetheart, running away from home is not the answer. We can get you help. We can sort this problem out. Mum, I'm not in a position to be a good mother right now. If I look at Chloe too closely, I'll see the monster staring back at me. I don't trust myself to be around her at the minute. I'm consumed with such anger over what happened. Sweetheart, you know I'm on your side. I won't say a single word to Richard, but I don't think you should brush this under the carpet, love. You should go to the police. Get this whole wretched mess sorted out. Mum, the man that attacked me is dead. It's over now. I just need to get away. Things can go badly awry with the police. They could get things all twisted, and I don't want any of this. Very well, dear. Have it your way. You do what you need to do, and I will try to calm the storm down with Richard. Mum, you're the best. That's why I love you so much. You're the best. Sweetheart, please get some counselling wherever you go. You're a great mother. Chloe needs you. So does Richard. And so do I. You must remember Chloe didn't ask for any of this to happen. She's still your little girl, with your blood running through her veins, and you would do well to remember that. Chloe doesn't need a mother like me at the moment, Mum. I'm not in a good place at the moment. Well, that's understandable, love. Of course it is. Do what you need to do. I will tell everyone you needed a break, to just get your head sorted out, and that you'll be back. Your secret is safe with me. You're right. Richard does not need to know about any of this.
As I sat there in the SUV at the parking lot of the supermarket, I began to blubber and let it all out. I had gone away for 7 whole years, and now I was back in town. The thought of confronting the demons of my past was too close for comfort. The picture of the man who had raped me on the beach kept flooding into my memory. But with the therapy I'd enjoyed in Florida, I had begun to realize that despite everything, I still very much loved my little girl Chloe. Even though she was the progeny of the monster, it certainly did not make her one. I had got divorced from Richard several years ago, even though I'd loved him very much, but I knew I needed to let him go. I needed to separate myself from my life at Golden Sands. But now that I was back in this part of the world, the longing to be reunited with little Chloe was all-consuming. I could only hope that Andrea would live up to her promises to me and be an intermediary for me with Richard. Richard needed to know that I wanted to be part of my little girl's life again. But I knew that Andrea was absolutely right, that he would be less than enamoured to hear I was in town again, after I'd swanned off and left him to take care of little Chloe all on his own. I was sure he must feel very resentful, aggrieved and embittered towards me, and I could barely blame him for that. Eventually I did receive a message from Andrea, telling me that Richard was willing to meet me at a watering hole outside the town, far away from gossiping tongues and snoopy locals, and that suited me just fine. I knew the place well enough, but hadn't been there for many years. When I arrived at the bar, it was bursting with activity. I could see no sign of Richard, and my heart began to dip, as one thing about Richard was he was always very punctual. I found a seat at a table at the far end of the bar, while I listened to the background clatter of cutlery, glasses tinkling and people laughing. A waitress was delivering platters of burgers and chips to tables, and the greasy, fatty smell made me feel quite nauseous. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my legs were trembling as I tapped the red velvety carpet beneath my feet rather nervously. It was a long while later that a lofty figure entered the bar, and stood there surveying all the patrons, as if looking for someone in particular. I recognized that it was Richard. In 7 years, Richard's dark hair had gone completely grey. He stood there for a brief moment, staring at the crowd, and then finally his eyes met mine across the room, and he walked over to me.
Well, well, look who we have here.
"Hello, Richard. How are you?" I asked.
You're asking me how I am, are you, Aoife? That's rich coming from you, isn't it? I didn't even know you cared about my welfare. How do you think I've been over the last 7 years? When you sashayed off out of my life, leaving me to take care of little Chloe all on my own. Why did you do it, Aoife? I've always tried to get my head around that question. We were good together, both of us. You were the love of my life. Why did you up and leave like that? You broke my heart. You wantonly tore our lives to shreds. And for what?
"Sit down, Richard," I said, gesturing for him to take a seat. I called the waitress over and ordered 2 beers for us. "It's complicated, Richard," I said, taking a seat.
"No, it's not complicated," said Richard, frowning. "Things only get complicated if you make them like that, Aoife. I loved you. Having little Chloe was the best thing that had ever happened to us. But then you bobbed off into the sunset, didn't you? Abandoning me and our 6-month-old baby. It was so out of character for you to behave like that. And then out of the blue I get a divorce notice in the post. You certainly know how to kick a guy when he's down, Aoife. I'll give you that."
"I'm not proud of myself, Richard. All you need to know is what I did was not good, and I appreciate that. But I was in a very bad place.
A really, really bad place. An all-time low. I didn't trust myself to be a good mother to Chloe. I couldn't be around her. I just couldn't. So you had a bad case of postnatal depression. Believe it or not, I understand that, Aoife. I really do. Some people can have it bad. I've read all about it. But why didn't you speak to me if you were depressed? You could have got yourself help. Instead, you just run away. We could have fixed things together. Running away from your problems is not a good way to solve anything.
I wish it was as straightforward as that, Richard, but I regret to tell you it isn't.
So you're in town now, like a rash, are you? And you want to have access to Chloe? Is that it?
Richard, please, she's my daughter. She deserves to get to know her mother, does she not? The waitress arrived on the scene, presenting us both with our drinks. Richard took a sip of his craft beer. He crowned his lips with some of the foam, which he wiped away with the back of his arm.
You've been away for 7 long years, Aoife. That's a hell of a long time as far as I'm concerned. I have a fiancée now called Lacey. She looks after Chloe when I'm at work. She's currently looking after Chloe now, even as I speak. Chloe has no idea who you are. She doesn't even know you're her birth mother. She's a well-rounded, happy little girl, and I want her to stay that way. She only knows Lacey as her mother. What am I supposed to say to her? We don't need to confuse our little girl. But you're right. I can't possibly stop you from seeing her. You're her birth mother by rights. That would not be ethical or right to do. We will have to work out a plan between ourselves.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. I don't know what to say. You're being very good about this. You really are.
I'm not being good for your sake, Aoife. I'm really not. I'm not that nice a person, I'm afraid. I'm just thinking of the best interests of Chloe. She needs to have a relationship with her birth mother, whether I like it or not. If I don't allow that to happen, it would make me completely unreasonable. But I do need to know, Aoife, that you intend to stay here, that you're not just going to bugger off again. Chloe's an impressionable young girl, very sensitive. She does not need to be messed around, and I won't stand for it if she is.
I'm staying here permanently, Richard, at Golden Sands. I'm going to be looking after my mother. I'm sure you've heard about her unfortunate diagnosis.
Richard frowned. I'm very sorry, Aoife. That's hard. I know how much you love your mother. I really do. She's been such a great grandmother to little Chloe. I can't fault her in that.
How is Chloe, Richard? I asked.
Richard pulled out his cell phone and handed it over to me. That's her in the pictures. Everyone says she's a splitting image of me. Got my hair and eyes, but she's definitely got your nose. I see you in her as well.
I could feel my body trembling and shaking like a jelly as I studied the pictures of my beloved little girl. Tears spilled down my cheeks. To my surprise, Richard reached out to squeeze my arm.
She's a lovely little girl, isn't she? I just don't want you to hurt her, Aoife. That's all I care about. That's all that matters at the end of the day.
I'm in a better place now, Richard, I told him. I saw a therapist in Florida, Mrs. Senderwood. She helped me to move out of muddy waters.
Richard's face softened. I'm glad to hear that, Aoife. You're looking as lovely as I remember. Very radiant. And your hair is so long these days. When you left, all those years ago, it was shoulder length.
I know, I chuckled. I've been struggling to grow it all my life. And then suddenly it started to grow when I was in Florida.
Well, it suits you, Aoife. You look great.
Tell me about Chloe, Richard. I want to know all about my little girl.
Well, she's a very sweet little girl. She's terribly naughty, though.
I chuckled. That sounds familiar. Mum was always accusing me of being very naughty when I was, Chloe's age.
Well, she's always getting up to mischief, isn't she? She loves to investigate everything. She's always asking questions like, why do birds fly? Why do they live in trees? Why do they sing? Questions like that. She's always looking under stones to see if she can find insects. Curious about everything, she is.
So when can I see her, Richard? She sounds so delightful. I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I really would like to see her as soon as possible, if I may.
Well, how about I drop her off at your mother's house to visit her grandmother tomorrow? You can introduce yourself to her as your mother's friend. I will get Lacey, my fiancée, to drop her off at Golden Sands for you. Chloe loves going to Golden Sands. She adores the beach there. She can spend the entire day with you. But for God's sake, don't you dare tell her you're her mother.
Well, of course I wouldn't do that. That would be terribly insensitive. Thanks for being so reasonable, Richard, about this. I thought you'd be furious with me after everything I did. And I can't blame you. If I'd been wearing your shoes, I would have been livid.
Richard's expression looked pained. I've always loved you, Aoife. It never goes away, that you know. Yes, I was enraged with you. I'm not going to deny that. But I knew you well enough to know that you had your very good reasons for leaving, whatever they were. And I still don't know.
You don't?
No, of course I don't. But there is no point living in life with bitterness. Life is far too short, don't you think? I forgave you for leaving a long time ago. Although there was a time, I will not kid, that I wanted to throttle you personally. But not any more. I'm over that now.
When I finally left Richard to return to Golden Sands, I was feeling incredibly optimistic. I had thought that Richard would have been furious with me, but he was genuinely thrilled to see me. And the old spark that had been there 7 years before was still there against all the odds. I was surprised that he didn't hate me with a passion, but instead he'd been incredibly reasonable to me about everything. My mother was absolutely right. Richard was a very good, very ethical man. I couldn't believe he completely understood that I had my personal reasons for leaving home. But he cared only that my return to Oregon would be permanent, so that I didn't hurt little Chloe, and that was a reasonable, understandable request on his part. But I knew that now that I'd come home, I would not be going anywhere. I was thrilled to be back at Golden Sands. I did know that gossip was rife in town, when people learnt that I'd returned. I knew unkind words were invariably being spattered around about me, like the oil from a deep fat fryer.
Selfish bitch! What kind of a mother is she, I mean, to walk out on her baby like that? How dare she think she can come back after all this time? The woman is completely sick in the head!
How did it go? My mother asked me when I returned home.
Has Richard agreed to let you see Chloe? I do hope he has.
Mum, Richard was absolutely amazing. I can hardly believe it. He was kind and non-judgmental about everything I've done. And believe it or not, there's still a spark between us, even after all this time. I really felt it. It was very strong.
My mother shook her head sadly. I'm afraid, sweetheart, don't get your hopes up. That ship has long since sailed. You do know he's betrothed to Lacey. He's going to marry another woman. He's engaged to her.
I know, Mum. But the best news is that Lacey is going to drop off little Chloe tomorrow for me at Golden Sands, so that I can spend the day with her. Isn't that brilliant news?
I told you Richard would come through for you, said my mother. I am so pleased to hear that. But you do need to tread very carefully with young Chloe. You must remember she has no idea you are her mother.
Of course, Mum. I realise that. I have no intention of telling her who I really am.
Well, as long as you don't, that's all that matters. But I'm thrilled to hear your great news.
The following morning I could barely wait to see Chloe again. I kept glancing out of the window, in the hope I'd see Lacey's car, driving up our driveway.
Sweetheart, said my mother, the more you keep looking out of the window, the longer it'll be before Lacey gets here. Don't you know the saying that a watched pot never boils?
I sighed. I know you're right, Mum. I just can't help myself. I'm so excited about seeing my little girl again. Seconds later we heard a car driving up the driveway, until it finally reached a standstill. I ran hurriedly to the window and saw a pretty young woman with long blonde hair, wearing a white cotton tunic dress, climbing out of her car. She then walked over to the passenger side, and opened it up for little Chloe to get out. In that moment, my heart almost missed a beat, as I saw Lacey taking the little girl's hand and marching towards the front door. I was astonished and confounded, because little Chloe looked exactly like Richard. How was that even possible? Why didn't she resemble the monster? Moments after a knock came to the front door, I churlishly opened it. I was certain that Lacey would be mean and spiteful towards me, because I was the mother that had wantonly abandoned my little girl. But I was very surprised and bewildered to see no judgment in her blue eyes. I didn't want to like her at all, but I couldn't help but do so. The future Lacey Douglas was a very warm person indeed. But why was I surprised? Richard would never be attracted to anyone who didn't have a charming personality. "Hello there," said Lacey, reaching out to shake my hand. "You must be Aoife. Richard has told me so much about you. I'm so glad you're finally back in town." She turned around to look down at Chloe. "Chloe, this is Aoife, a friend of your grandmother's. She's going to spend the day with you. Are you going to say hello to her?" "Hello, Aoife," said little Chloe shyly, looking at me through her bright blue eyes. "Hello, Chloe. What have you got in your bag there?" "Mummy says that you're going to take me on the beach to play with my bucket and spade because I want to build sand castles. Do you like sand castles, Aoife?" "Oh, I love sand castles," I said with a huge grin on my face that I just couldn't wipe off. "Good, because then you can help me if you like to build them. I want to build a big fort. I've got 2 buckets and spades, so you can use one of them if you like." "That's very kind of you. If you don't mind lending me one of them, I'd really appreciate that." Lacey nodded at me and gave me a wink. "I'm going to go now. I think it's an appropriate thing to go now," she said, "but I'll pick you up later, little Chloe. Are you going to give me a hug before I go?" The little girl ran over to Lacey and threw her arms lovingly around her. "Bye-bye, Mummy. I'll see you later." "You be a good little girl for Aoife and Granny Claudia, will you?" "Of course I'll be good. I'm always good," said Chloe with a twinkle in her eyes. After Lacey was gone, I quickly prepared a picnic bag, and before long little Chloe was walking with me down the beach. It was just the most wonderful feeling to be walking next to my little girl, the most natural feeling in the entire world. There was nothing quite like it. "I like it here at Golden Sands," she told me. "I love the beach. Where I live, there's no beach. I wish we lived here. It takes us 10 minutes in the car to get to the beach." "It's nice being by the beach, isn't it?" I said, chuckling. "It's the best," said Chloe with a big grin. Before long, Chloe and I were happily sitting together on the soft golden beach sand, making sand castles. Our hands enjoyed the feel of the soft sand brushing against our fingers. It was such a blissfully beautiful sunny day. Seagulls screeched above our heads, and the crashing waves roared thunderously as they hit the shoreline in a white, elegant spray. It was so wonderful spending quality time with my little girl. But I was struck again and again by how like Richard she was in every way, in her gestures, mannerisms, and physical appearance. A troubling, disconcerting thought began to plague me somewhat. What if the DNA test had been wrong? What if Richard really was my daughter's father? No, of course she's not, I told myself. The more I questioned myself over this, the more unlikely it seemed, as a DNA laboratory test did not get their results wrong. Whether I wanted to believe it or not, that monster that had attacked me on the beach that day was Chloe's father, and I needed to get my head around that. After Chloe had finished building sandcastles, we both went exploring the rock pools together. Chloe stared down into the crystal blue water, watching the tiny fish darting around, with an expression of jubilation on her face. She giggled happily. "Look at that fish over there, Aoife! It's silver with a yellow stripe. That one has a blue stripe. They're so tiny and pretty. I'm going to draw them later when I get back home." "They are tiny, aren't they?" I said to Aoife. She sighed in frustration. But they're far too fast to catch, she complained. I wish I could catch one of them. I would put it back. I don't want to hurt it. I just want to feel it in my fingers. Of course you don't want to hurt it. You're a nice girl, I said to Chloe. I don't think I'm that nice, Aoife, she said, frowning. 'Cause you see, I eat dinosaur fish fingers, so I'm eating real fish, aren't I? They want you to believe you're eating baby dinosaurs, but they're made out of fish, you see. Well, what's wrong with that? I asked. 'Cause I'm eating fish, silly. I wish I didn't like dinosaur fish fingers so much. I do wish I could be a vegan. My friend Carla, she's vegan. When I go to her house, the food is really, really yucky. They drink almond milk instead of cow's milk, and they don't eat any meat. They eat a substitute, you see, that's supposed to taste like meat, but it's like rubber. It's really horrible. Well, that's vegan for you. They avoid all meat, you see. But I wish I could be like that. But I like meat too much. Does that make me a bad person, Aoife? 'Cause things have to be killed for me to eat. It doesn't make you a bad person, Chloe, if you eat meat. Where did you get that idea from? I couldn't believe my 7-year-old daughter was talking like this. I was touched to the quick at her level of perception and sensitivity. You know, sometimes we do have to kill, don't we, Chloe? Think about a lion in the wilds of Africa, for example. A lion cannot possibly survive on vegetables alone. He's forced to kill whether he likes it or not. Otherwise, he will surely die. But I didn't think of it like that. But you're right, Aoife. But I still feel very sorry for the lion, 'cause he has to kill even if he doesn't want to. He can't go vegan, can he? No, he can't. Even if he wanted to, he can't. And some people are like that. They may want to be vegan, but they can't because they love meat too much. And there's nothing wrong with that. Daddy also likes meat too much. He always likes to eat T-bone steaks. There you are, then. My heart melted like butter on a corn cob, listening to my daughter's deep observations. I could see she was a big thinker, and I really liked that about her. What had ever induced me to leave my daughter all those years ago? She was the most beautiful thing I had ever beheld. It was as we were playing around on the rocks that I had the overwhelming sense that Chloe and I were not alone. Something or someone was watching us. I had experienced that unsettling feeling once before on this beach. An insidious experience that had made every part of me become frigid with fear. I had been flooded with an adrenal response that had encouraged me to run, but somehow it was almost as if there was a short in the direct line of communication between both my body and brain, and before I could react, I had seen the man who was later to attack me. The memory unfortunately came flooding back for a brief second, as I stood there on the rocks with my little girl. The oddest feeling on this occasion was I found that the feeling of being watched felt both benign and benevolent. Maybe it was because I was so deliriously happy spending this time with my beautiful little girl, with her wide, earnest eyes and cherub-like cheeks, that I could not envisage anything bad could ever happen when spending time in her company. At this moment I was actually standing on the rocks, probably yards away from the spot where I had been attacked all those years ago. But I was now thankfully replacing horrifying flashbacks with great memories that I was creating with my little girl. Don't be silly, I persuaded myself. No one is watching you. It's all in your head. But as I briefly glanced towards the trees, I saw a tall, dark, shadowy silhouette, looking straight at me, with recognition on his face. It was the male Bigfoot that had rescued me all those years ago, and had sat with me on the beach. I was filled with an overwhelming sense of gratitude, as the Bigfoot's treacle-coloured eyes held mine for a moment. I was flooded with such warmth. It was almost like the Bigfoot was genuinely pleased to see me again, absolutely delighted I had returned to the same beach, and had recovered from my ordeal. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other, but it felt like a good 10 minutes or so. Chloe noticed absolutely nothing. She was gazing into the rock pools, goggling happily at the little fish. that she was trying so desperately to catch with her tiny little hands. The Bigfoot nodded at me and then turned around and glided away, and I felt such love in my heart. I had no idea that this day was about to only get better when I saw Lacey walking down the beach towards me. She had a warm smile on her face. This was Richard's fiancée. Every single part of me wanted to despise her and dislike her, but I couldn't do that because she was a genuinely nice person. "It's Mummy!" cried Chloe in delight. She ran eagerly across the rocks to throw her tiny arms affectionately around Lacey's legs. "Mummy, I want to show you the fish in the rock pool," she said happily. "They're so fast, but they're so tiny. I want you to see them." I sat back on the beach sand, watching Lacey happily interact with little Chloe, and then she led Chloe by the hand and told her to build some more sandcastles. "You build something nice for me, Chloe, will you? I'm going to sit next to Eva for a moment to have a little chat." "But what must I build?" asked Chloe. "Make me a princess castle." Chloe looked pleased and began energetically building more sandcastles in the sand. "Mind if I join you?" asked Lacey. "Of course not," I said, gesturing for Lacey to sit down on the sand close to me. "I must say I love coming to Golden Sands. It's always an excuse to come to the beach. And I just love the ocean," said Lacey, staring out at it contentedly as the waves thrashed against the shoreline. "I don't know, I just find it so soothing being out on the beach. Don't you?" she asked me. "Of course," I said. "There's nothing like it. Did you miss this place when you went to Florida? I bet you must have. Like you can't believe," I admitted. "You do know that Richard is still madly in love with you, Aoife." "What?" I said, staring up at Lacey in surprise. This I did not expect to hear from the fiancé of my ex-husband. "Sorry, what are you talking about? You're engaged to Richard, aren't you?" "I'm divorced from Richard, and I'm incredibly grateful that you are both agreeing to let me see my little girl. You have no idea what this means to me. I appreciate it so much." I was surprised that you and Richard were so reasonable towards me, given what I put Richard through. I'm sure Richard loves you very much, Lacey, and I would never want to come between the both of you. I really wouldn't, but I do want to have access to my daughter. I'm sure you can understand that. Lacey frowned. "That's the problem. You've always been between us, Aoife. Even when Richard told me that you were in his past, that he wanted to forget all about you, I knew he never could. I could always see this longing in his eyes. I wanted to believe he'd got over you, but he never did. He never stopped loving you, Aoife. When you met up with him the other night at the bar, I knew when he returned that he was still in love with you. It was so clearly written all over his face. I said to him, 'Admit it, Richard. You're still in love with Aoife, aren't you?' He tried to avoid my gaze, and then with a very guilty hangdog expression on his face, he admitted that he still loved you very much, and that he was terribly sorry that he still felt this way about you. He felt bad for me, but he couldn't help it. Nobody can help who they love, can they?" "What are you saying exactly?" I asked. "I'm saying that I can't possibly marry a man who's in love with someone else. I may be engaged to Richard, but it's not going to work out. It never would. I told Richard as much last night. We broke up as he agreed he could never love me like he loves you." "He actually said that to you?" I asked in bewilderment. "I'm afraid so. But then again, I knew in my heart all along, Aoife, that Richard would never be mine. Not really. I'm glad you came back in time. And I do hope that you and Richard can make a go of things together. You really do have my blessing in that department." "I cannot believe Richard said all that to you about me. And I'm very sorry, Lacey, that he's broken your heart and that your relationship has ended. I feel very bad about this. I don't understand why he doesn't hate me after all the things I put him through. I wasn't kind, walking away from him in the way I did. But love is not like that, Aoife, don't you see? Richard forgave you a long time ago." "But what about Chloe? You love her, don't you, Lacey? She calls you Mummy." "Of course I love her, very, very much. And I would still like to be involved in her life, But at the end of the day, you are her real mother. She needs to get to know you. Well, I'm not sure if Richard and I can really fix everything that happened between us, I said to Lacey. There's so much water under the bridge, isn't there? But is there, Aoife? I'm not sure there is. You had your reasons for going away, I'm sure you did. And I don't pretend to understand that. But I'm certainly not going to judge you for them. But I do know that if you can fix the damage that has happened between the two of you, you should do it. It's really worth it for the sake of little Chloe. And Richard is one of the finest men you can ever hope to meet. If he still loves you, I say go for it, girl. And to my amazement, Lacey wrapped me warmly up in her arms and gave me a big hug, even though there were tears in her eyes. I realized that Lacey was an exceptionally kind soul to let go of the man she loved because she recognized he was in love with someone else. In truth, I really thought it unlikely that Richard and I could make a go of things after I'd buggered off for 7 long years. But I was proved wrong, as the love between us just bloomed. Richard forgave me for leaving him. I don't know why you went away, Aoife, but I know you had your reasons. I forgave you a long time ago. Lacey's right about that. I just know one thing for sure, and that is I cannot live without you. So I want us to put this behind us. In truth, I don't think I could have ever married Lacey, even though she's a very good woman. So I'm glad she ended the relationship with me. I knew when I saw you in the bar that night, I could never marry her. I wanted to lash out at you when I saw you, but all I felt towards you was incredible love. I wanted to just run into your arms and embrace you. It was all I could do to restrain myself from doing so, because I was supposed to hate you. I was supposed to despise you for what you had done. I felt compelled to tell Richard why I'd left him all those years ago. But how could I? Because then he would know Chloe was not his little girl, and I knew that this news would absolutely devastate him. But Chloe was so like Richard that I decided to repeat the DNA tests over again, and this time they came back as a match for Chloe being Richard's girl. When I read the results, I was in total shock, as was my mother. We were both astounded. How was this at all possible? All I can say is I must have stuffed up the DNA tests myself, or the laboratory for once in their life got it all wrong. When I realized Chloe was really Richard's, I was so incredibly happy, but angry with myself for wasting so many years. In the end, I was able to convey to Richard the reason why I'd run away. He was completely confounded by everything. He told me that even if Chloe was not his little girl, that if she was a part of me, he would have always loved her regardless. Surely you know that, Aoife. I'd never have blamed you for being raped on the beach. I wish you hadn't kept all this from me. Do you know, Aoife, being a father is more than about just blood. And regardless of whether Chloe was mine or not, it wouldn't have changed a single thing. But God knows how those DNA tests got it all so wrong. Maybe it was a computer glitch or something. Or maybe you personally contaminated the samples that you sent off. But whatever happened, something went wrong. I never did find out who the man was that attacked me all those years ago. And in truth, I do not want to know. He remains a John Doe as far as I'm concerned. A year after Richard and I got together, my mother had a stroke and died. In truth, it was a real blessing in disguise. My mother would have hated to have lived a life not knowing her own children. Me and Richard sold up the designer home we lived in and moved to Golden Sands, much to Chloe's delight, as nothing beats a house on the beach. Richard and I got remarried, and my daughter Chloe believes she's the luckiest girl in the world because she has 2 mothers, because we made Lacey her godmother, and I am her birth mother. Lacey has become one of my very best friends. She's now married to a lovely gentleman. So everything worked out in the end in ways I could never have imagined possible. But then again, I always believe life has a way of making the mud finally settle. And as for the Bigfoot, I haven't seen him again, but I still believe he's out there, and I feel safer knowing he's around. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the Omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my Omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.